How are you doing, Wichita? We're happy that you guys could join us here for this CPAC conversation. But first, before we get started, we'd like to start all of our events with a quick prayer of thankfulness. Would you all please rise? Introduce our board member, Carolyn Meadows from the American Conservative Union.
Hello, Wichita. If you'd bow your heads, we'll have a brief prayer. Father God, we thank you for this opportunity to freely assemble and to unite in our efforts to make our home, America, a better place to live. I pray that the words of each presenter will be pleasing in your sight and a blessed message we will take with us when we leave this place. I offer prayers for President Trump and all who are elected, the officials that are in our government. I pray that they will have servants' hearts and seek your wisdom in all the decisions they make. Prayers also for our military and all who serve in law enforcement. Protect them as they protect the citizens of our great country. And as we approach Veterans Day, I pray for the heroes who defended and who now defend our country, and for the families who grieve for those who will not come home. Thank you, Father, for all who came today, and I ask your blessing on each family represented. And when our days on this earth end, may we all be able to say, I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. And for it's in our Holy Father's name that we pray. Amen.
Amen. Would you please remain standing and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. It brings us great pleasure, and it's a great honor, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce the Mayor of Wichita, Mayor Jeff Longwell, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, and good evening to all of you. Want to welcome certainly Matt and Mercy Schlapp. I call her Mercy like she's my best friend, right? But we have the matriarch of that group with us today, and I had the pleasure of working with her on the city council, and so Sue Schlapp is with us tonight. Sue, thank you for being here. Sue's a former city council person who served this city very well and gets credit for raising a couple of really smart kids. We are so fortunate in Wichita to have such a strong connection to the White House, and very fortunate to have two political heavyweights with us tonight. As most of you probably know, Mercedes now works for the Trump administration, but we have Phil Ruffin, who is a Wichitan, who owns a lot of property that's connected to Donald Trump. We have the CIA director that was just in town Monday sharing all of his stories about Washington, D.C. and running the CIA, and he shared a number of stories about lying, cheating, and stealing, and didn't mention a Democrat by name. But the mission of the CIA obviously deals with much of that, and we're lucky to have Mike Pompeo. And even though we've had a Schlapp that had great ties to the White House in the past, I think we now have the best Schlapp that's tied to the White House, and so we're lucky to have Mercedes with us tonight as well as Matt. So you're in for a treat. We're glad that you could be here. I think this is truly special to have our friends Matt and Mercedes back in their hometown, Wichita. So thank you to both of them. And Matt, the floor is all yours.
Thank you again, Mayor Longwell. If we could have our executive director from the American Conservative Union, Dan Schneider, come join us on stage. And of course, the chairman of the American Conservative Union, Matt Schlapp. And conducting our first part of the program is going to be the Breitbart London editor. You may recognize him from Sirius XM, one of our co-hosts from XM Patriot Radio on Channel 125. He's also got a great new book out called No-Go Zones that you want to pick out. And he's also Nigel Farage's right-hand man and was instrumental in making sure that Great Britain could preserve its own sovereignty in the Brexit forum. Thank you so much for joining us. Raheem Kassam, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Ian. Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for having us here. It's my great pleasure to be able to speak to both Dan and Matt about what the ACU has been doing and the future of the ACU. And genuinely, we haven't actually gone back and forth on this. So this is genuine questions that I'm going to ask them that I'm curious about.
This is dangerous.
Don't worry, there's going to be no salary questions here. Don't worry. I'm going to start with you, Dan, because you helped have Nigel Farage, the Brexit leader, over to CPAC last year. We spoke to you about it first. You had a huge whiteboard on the wall of all of the things that were going to take place at last year's CPAC there at the Gaylord National Convention. I just want to ask you, because it's so alien to me, that level of hard work, how much time and effort goes into that, and how do you manage to pull something like that together with, really what seemed to me like quite a small team?
Yeah, let's see, am I on now? You're on. Yeah, so you are correct. Maybe the thing we're best known for is CPAC. Matt was elected chairman of the American Conservative Union just 3.5 years ago, and I was hired as the executive director about that same time, which sort of the interesting thing here, especially for this audience, is that you actually have two Kansas boys who are running ACU. And in terms of Matt's salary, he actually gets nothing. He serves pro bono as chairman. But we when we took over the leadership of ACU, we first fixed CPAC. We made CPAC much more impactful, and then used that as the basis to launch what we call CPAC 365, so that year-round we do events like this one all over the country, as well as the many other things that we do. But when it comes to CPAC, we design it specifically to achieve three outcomes: to educate people who are coming to CPAC and who watch it all over the world, equip them with skills to become effective activists, and then motivate them to use the new knowledge and new skills to change the direction of the country.
But I wanted some horror stories. How the sausage is made.
There's a lot of horror stories, tons.
Well, Matt. So as what Dan was talking about, just tell us about the other things that the ACU is doing that we might not often see up front as big ACU productions like CPAC, but things up and down the country, and like your radio show on Sirius XM that have a huge difference on the conversation in the country.
The radio show that I took over, just so you know, Mercy and I started this radio show together. It's called CPAC 365. It's on. Any of you listen to Sirius XM? Yes, love it.
Not enough.
Not enough. Raheem has a show on Sirius as well. What I love about Sirius is, most people, or many, listen to it in their car. So it's like the classic American dream scenario. An American in their car listening to conservative politics, and then using their cell phones to call into the show. And I can't tell you how many times we get callers, and I think they're from Indiana, and I'm like, "Hey, Joe from Indiana, what's on your mind?" He goes, "Well, I'm now in Illinois. I just left Indiana, and I have a question." So we have a lot of fun with it. But I deposed Mercy from the show because when she went to go work for the White House, and I became a full-time mom and dad, it seems like. No, that's not fair. But I'm doing much better with my cooking. My carpool driving, mediocre. But anyway, we have a lot of fun with the show. So ACU, look, it's messy, right? Politics in America is very messy right now. All the old ways of doing things in the conventions, seems like many have been discarded. And I would say what's going on with the Republican Party and with conservatives, and just with Americans, is they're looking at their country and they don't like everything they see. And they see over the course of the last decade that the country has slid to a place that alarms them. And I would say one of the main reasons why Dan and I and our team were really hitting the road is, I don't know if I asked a show of hands about how many people here are Republican or how many people would call themselves conservatives. What we find more and more is you have people that maybe don't associate with a party or with an ideology, who are just worried about their country, and they would like to find constructive, practical ways to try to help people and help their own families. And so while we're on the road, and Carolyn, a beautiful prayer, because I thought you really captured it, Carolyn Meadows, who said the prayer, is one of our board members. She's from Georgia. The reason why we're going everywhere is because we really, I don't want to be an alarmist, but we are concerned about how far things have slipped. And we believe that if we use the same old conventions to try to solve the problems, it ain't going to get it done.
I just want to follow up on that. When you say how far things have slipped, give us an idea of the things that come to your mind when you say that, and the things that the AC, and how the ACU ranks those things.
Well, the reason why we're here today, and Dan would do a much more eloquent job, which is there are some things about the past that we've gotten foggy about, that we need to grab hold of and remember the lessons and bring them to today, which is why today we're going to focus on Ronald Reagan's successful presidency, what leadership really is, and why the economy and foreign policy come together with our values in a really important way when it comes to public policy. So we have to remember some of those things of the past, but you know, to put a fine point on it, the last 8 years of a very radicalized White House, whether you care about culture and the family, or whether you care about national security and America leading, or you just care about free markets and the ability to hold on to the money you work so hard to make, and any dozens of topics in each one of those buckets, we slid substantially. And we slid even sometimes with Republicans running Congress, because some of them they weren't alarmed enough about how fast things were changing in the wrong direction.
Dan.
So maybe I'll add some practical points to what Matt said, as well as some philosophical ideas. So what does ACU do? Well, we define conservatism. You've got the word conservative up there on the screen. We're the organization that explains to people what conservatism is. You being a good Brit and familiar with the great philosophers of the 16 and 1700s, you understand classical liberalism. Charles Koch refers to himself as a classical liberal. That's what a modern conservative is. We conserve the ideas of the liberalism of the 16 and 1700s, which is the idea that your rights are naturally yours. Your rights do not come from a king or from government or the Constitution. The Constitution merely reflects the rights that you already have. So we define conservatism. We rate members of Congress. We've been doing that for 5 decades. We're the organization that determines how liberal or conservative a member of Congress is based on their voting record. And we now do that in all 50 state legislatures. So 8,000 elected officials every year we rate so that people know how liberal their elected official is. We do forums and things like this here so that people learn, and then we engage in activism. So here's the thing that ACU does that nobody else does, in addition to defining conservatism. We combine ideas with action. And it's really important. If you know anything about boxing, it's a 1-2 punch, ideas and action combined.
I've also seen you guys have had, over the last couple of CPACs especially, this huge international contingent to it as well. It's almost like you guys are not just,
because we allowed you to come.
well, quite right. Hey, but you know, I've got my socks on.
Where'd you get the scarf? People in Kansas have never seen this kind of thing before.
This is from a Charles Tyrwhitt, which is a British shop actually, but from Washington D.C. Thank you for that, Matt. You may leave now. The international stuff. Tell me how you did you stumble into that? Was it always a planned expansion? You know, you had Nigel Farage speaking last year. You have the Japanese always hosting a wonderful party at CPAC and contributing to the discussion. Is that part of future plans as well to broaden the appeal of ACU beyond America?
So our future is built on our past. We were founded in 1964 by William F. Buckley Jr. So if any of you watched Firing Line and that sort of thing back then, he's our founder. And the message of freedom is a universal one that some people reject, some people accept. But we were approached 4 years ago, just as Matt and I were taking over the leadership of ACU. We were approached by a Japanese man named Jay Aiba, who said, I've been coming to CPAC. I love what the American Conservative Union does. Can you help me establish the Japanese Conservative Union? So I'd like to say that we did all the work. We didn't. Jay is a great entrepreneurial guy. He did that. But then last December, we worked with him, and we had a great forum in Tokyo. And that forum has served as the basis for this December 16th and 17th, if anybody wants to go to Tokyo for the very first international CPAC. It's going to be a Japanese CPAC that includes people from all over Asia. Gordon Chang, who you'll be hearing from soon, will be there with his wife Lydia. And then just a couple months ago, Matt and I led a delegation to Jerusalem, where we spent a week meeting with the various counterparts in Israel, and that will be an ongoing effort.
You know, we've seen this before. You know, Raheem, that the story of the 80s was Ronald Reagan working with Margaret Thatcher, working with Pope John Paul Saint, Pope John Paul the Great, and other great leaders like Lech Walesa and others. And it seems like there are moments on the globe where a movement in one part of the world is matched by not exactly a copycat, but something similar. I think we see this with the symbiotic relationship between the Brexit vote and Americans' own kind of like revolt in 2016. So these things are happening. What I find interesting is that if I come home to Wichita, Kansas, and talk to friends about what troubles them, about what's happening here in their country, or what they feel optimistic about, it's similar to when you go talk to other people. When we just got back from Israel, they're facing the similar struggles. What's going on in Israel is a really neat entrepreneurial free market movement of innovation and ideas and business people deciding to make investments and have ownership and have an idea and change people's lives. And they're obviously coordinating with American investors and realizing that that's working on the economic front. Now they're looking to their political system and they're saying, wait, maybe we should have a written constitution. Maybe we should have a written Bill of Rights. Maybe we should reconsider these things that we've struggled with in the past. What does it mean to be a citizen? What does it mean to have human rights? So what I think is cool is that what we're facing as a country, we have a lot of brothers and sisters in other countries who are facing very similar questions. And so they're coming to ACU and saying, hey, this conservative movement in America, it sure makes a difference. We need this over here. We have aspects of it, but we don't have anything that's quite like it.
Well, I can speak from experience, and having said, if we had the ACU in the United Kingdom, or a sister-like organisation, we wouldn't have won the Brexit vote 52-48. We would have won it 98-2. Right. Quite frankly, that is the level of difference I think you guys make, and that having this institutionalised way of doing things makes. You look like you want to say something.
I do want to say something. That Brexit, does the UK, the United Kingdom, leave that European Union, and Nigel Farage and Raheem really led that effort. It was so critically important to anybody who loves freedom and believes in sovereignty that was a successful vote. It is just shocking. Essentially, 5 or 6 people control the lives of Europeans. The way that the European Parliament, there's a parliament now for the whole continent of Europe, and that European Parliament dictates how the people in the United Kingdom and Belgium and France and Ireland will live their lives. The people elected or assigned, you're not even elected to the European Parliament. If you're the leader of a political party in a country, you automatically get a seat. That's all for show. Ultimately, there's just a handful of people, Europeans, who are dictating how people are going to live their lives. Had the UK been unsuccessful in separating, that would have been terrible. And had Barack Obama's vision been effectuated, we would have been going down that same path, denying individuals the right to participate in government and to control their own futures.
It was tomorrow night, 1 year ago, that your president-elect Donald Trump had me up to his penthouse in Midtown Manhattan, and it was myself, and it was Nigel Farage, and it was President-elect Trump, and it was Kellyanne Conway, and we sat around the couch, and President-elect Trump looked at me and he said, "What does this mean that we won this?" And we went through it, and we got, we started to talk about, and you might wonder why now we've spent 4 minutes talking about international stuff here in Wichita. But we talked about it, and he said, you know, I don't think if Brexit hadn't happened, if June the 23rd hadn't happened in the United Kingdom, I'm not sure we would have got this victory on November the 8th last year. That's what he said. And so the things are inextricably linked. It's ironic, isn't it? It's the globalization of nationism and nationalism and patriotism and these things that were so hard fought for. And that's sort of why I wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about the international stuff. So tell us, we've got a couple of minutes left. Give us a preview of the next year to come. I'm obviously very excited about CPAC. By the way, I've been going to CPAC for 10 years now. I actually started going as a student. And I love those student prices, by the way. Can I get those again?
Well, you know, I'm getting close to that senior price, which is pretty good too. I don't know. How many of you have been to CPAC? I know Mom goes. We have several people who've been there. Thank you for going. And if you went as a student, like Raheem went as a student, you are welcome back as someone who's slightly older than being a student. We really do have all ages. It's about 50% college age or younger, and then you know, everybody else in between. But if you ever read or have to listen to how the millennial generation has, you know, abandoned all of these principles and that America is doomed because its young men and women have become, they feel the burn, they've become collectivists, come to CPAC. You'll feel great after about an hour when you just see all of these college kids who face all of this ridiculousness on campuses all over the country. They are flocking to places like CPAC to bond together, to plot, to organize, to figure out how to push back, to learn, to listen. So we really want you to know that you're all invited. I get asked all the time, how do I get on that list to come to CPAC? It's real easy. You just call us, or you go online and you reserve your slot. And we always have a big contingent from Wichita and from Kansas, and we want you to be there. And we have big plans for the group next year. I'm not going to make you answer the question. You've been handed a note. But the focus is going to be, there's a lot of important political activity next year in battleground states all over the country. I think we all realize that most of us probably associate with the Republican Party. I do. I'm a proud Republican. The Republican Party does not always get it right, as we watch painfully too often. And so we're going to be active in the states where there will be key elections and other important political activities. So when we get out of Tokyo, next year is going to be back focused on those states. So we hope to keep coming back to Wichita. It took us 3.5 years to get here, and this is a great turnout. So we appreciate you all being here. But Dan, do you have anything else to say about the schedule next year?
Yeah, just one thing about CPAC for next year. One of the things that Matt and I changed when we took over ACU was making sure that CPAC had a theme that actually drove the agenda designed to achieve real outcomes. So this year's theme, this is the first time we've publicly stated it, this year's theme is a time for action. This is built on Ronald Reagan's 1964 speech, right before the presidential campaign, or rather the presidential election, when Ronald Reagan gave his famous "A Time for Choosing" speech. And if you haven't ever seen his speech, go on YouTube, watch that 40-minute speech. It is mesmerizing. As a Kansas boy, I can say, in all honesty, I've never heard somebody talk about farm programs that made everyday Americans understand how critical freedom is. But so that was a time for choosing. All these years later, we have a president who is mostly aligned with conservatism and conservatives. We have a determined left who thought that they had won. They thought that they were on the path to fundamentally transforming America, and they are furious. So if we're going to make sure that we keep our freedoms, it has to be a time for action. So that's what this CPAC is really going to be about. And then I mentioned that we have forums. So I do want to sort of transition here and say that we've got two really important panels following this interaction here. The first panel is on national security. The second panel is on the economy, because that's what the Reagan Doctrine is all about. And we've got some really good people to talk about national security and foreign policy, including Rahim. Gordon Chang is going to be leading this as a participatory moderator. I just want to say a couple things about Gordon before we exit here. He is a senior fellow with the American Conservative Union Foundation. He writes for the Daily Beast. He is often on the John Batchelor Show every Monday and Wednesday at a minimum. If you've never heard the John Batchelor Show on radio, it's fantastic. More importantly, if you're in the National Security Council or at the Defense Department or the State Department, and you've got a question that relates to Asia, China, North Korea, Japan, Philippines, Indonesia, India, you're picking up the phone and you're calling Gordon Chang. Similarly, if you've got a question about Latin America, you're calling Joseph Umire or Joseph Humeyer. So we are really pleased that these two people are going to be joining Rahim on this next panel. It's going to be a great panel, foreign affairs, national security.
And we want you all to know that it's about your questions too. So you're going to be able to be a part of the conversation and ask your questions. So make sure you think about some really hard ones. Stump Rahim is going to be one of the themes.
Gonna have to wake up pretty early in the morning. Well, let me thank Matt Schlapp and Dan Schneider for kicking us off here today. Thank you not just for this and for being here in Wichita, and I'm sure it means a lot to the audience here, but thank you for everything you guys do with the ACU, really, truly. I mean, if this guy from West London that grew up, thinking he was going to be a mortgage broker one day, was so moved to come to CPAC, learn like I learned at your event, and kept coming back, now having the pleasure to work for Breitbart and Stephen K. Bannon, and it wouldn't have happened without what people like you have been doing out there. So thank you.
Gordon, come on up.
The defense policy of the United States is based on a simple premise. The United States does not start fights. We will never be an aggressor. We maintain our strength in order to deter and defend against aggression, to preserve freedom and peace. Since the dawn of the atomic age, we've sought to reduce the risk of war by maintaining a strong deterrent and by seeking genuine arms control. Deterrence means simply this: making sure any adversary who thinks about attacking the United States or our allies or our vital interests concludes that the risks to him outweigh any potential gains. Once he understands that, he won't attack. We maintain the peace through our strength. Weakness only invites aggression. This strategy of deterrence has not changed. It still works. But what it takes to maintain deterrence has changed.
Well, thank you very much, Dan, and you were much too kind about that. We are here today in the heartland to talk about important things. Not just our liberty, not just our democracy, but also our values, our way of life. And unfortunately, all of those things are now under attack from elements abroad. At this moment, our president is in Asia. He is rallying the region, confronting an existential threat, which are the missiles and the nukes of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The North Koreans say that they will use their weapons of mass destruction, and in fact, we know we sell them to their friends, the Syrians and the Iranians. Now, North Korea, Syria, and Iran could not mount a sustained challenge to the United States, to the international community, except that they do have big power sponsors. Those big power sponsors are led by willful men who view the world in the same way, who see their interests coinciding, and who identify the same adversary, and that is the United States. So we are indeed at a moment of peril. We have the Chinese and the Russians look at the world in very different ways than we do. But state actors are not the only ones that are threatening us at this moment. We have been engaged in a struggle for decades with others. Those others are terrorists. They are fueled by barbarism, and they fly the flag of Islam. Now today, the Islamic State, ISIS, no longer controls its capital of Raqqa, but its fighters have dispersed around the world, and that's where we will start. Now, Rahim, You've written that book that Ian talked about, No-Go Zones, how Sharia law is coming to a neighborhood near you. You live in Europe. Is Sharia coming to London? Is it coming to the rest of Europe?
Thanks, Gordon. I think the subtitle of the book it's how Sharia law, which is Islamic law, is coming to a neighborhood near you, was actually slightly disingenuous. It should have been how Sharia law is already in a neighborhood near you. This is not something that should shock anybody, but it still does for some reason. That when I travel across the United States, travel across Europe, and talk to people how it's no more than a couple of miles away from their doorsteps in some cases. I just actually flew here from Detroit, and if you go to Hamtramck, a city of 2.1 square miles, 17 mosques in that space. This is a place, by the way, where you have the Islamic call to prayer playing out on the streets 5 times a day. And for the book, I asked local officials, hey, so this was a thing since 2004. How did you reconcile this within your community, within your neighborhood? Because the residents I've spoken to, they don't like it. They said, oh no, it's fine. The mosques, they paid $500 to upkeep a local park. I said, so the call to prayer stopped then, right? Oh, no. So they sold out their community. They sold out this city for $500. This is happening all over the place at the moment. Let me come on to Europe for a second. You know, it may occur to some people that it's kind of strange to have an Englishman by the name Raheem Kassam. That's an Arabic name, by the way. And I was born into a Muslim family. I'll tell you more about that later if you want. Coming here to Wichita to talk about American national security. But the reason I do it, the reason I'm here, the reason I'm so keen on this, and the reason I'm so grateful for the ACU for having me here, I've seen my country go down the toilet already. I've seen what's going on in Germany. I've seen who's funding it. I've seen the reactions of our politicians who don't want to address it. In fact, our politicians who want to assist it. Our Prime Minister, Theresa May, quote, Sharia law can be good for Britain. That's why I find it so imperative.
There have been this wave of terrorist attacks across Europe. Some of them are very small cells. Is that partly a result of Sharia, or how do you see that?
It's a result of Islamic immigration en masse. You know, the largest scale migration we had into the United Kingdom before the 1970s was 50,000 French Huguenots. Do you know how long it took for those 50,000 French Huguenots who were fleeing persecution to come over? 100 years. Today, in the United Kingdom, we have a net migration rate, net, of 330,000 people a year, 600,000 gross people into the country every year. That's the size of a city, a major UK city coming into the country every day. Here's the thing. I'm not opposed to controlled immigration. I don't think there's a reasonable person out there who is opposed to controlled immigration. We have massive uncontrolled immigration. And what happens when so many people come to a country so quickly? They ghettoize. They don't learn the language. They make it so easy for radicals. I say radicals, I don't even mean radicals. Fundamentalists, Islamic fundamentalists, to poison their minds, to poison their kids' minds. There was a study that came out today that of the people who are on the government's watch list in the United Kingdom, over 50% of them are under the age of 24. It's the kids' minds that are being poisoned at the moment. And that's what's happening in these communities. I was lucky. My parents chose to live in a neighborhood different one to those of their colleagues who had migrated at the same time as them in the 1970s. I was lucky like that. But everyone else I grew up with, I've seen it happening to them. That's where this stuff comes from. And we've had 46 terror attacks in Europe this year. And only 2 of them were not Islamic or migration related.
Joseph Humar, you're the executive director of the Center for a Secure Free Society. You're an anti-terrorism expert, an expert in asymmetric warfare. You know, we've just heard Raheem talk about how Sharia law is coming to Europe. And of course, that brings up the issue of ISIS. So is ISIS coming to a continent near us?
I think ISIS is pretty much everywhere. and several remnants. You know, ISIS has a completely different model than other jihadist groups such as Al-Qaeda or Hezbollah that were much more about territorial control or about structure and operational control over their cells. ISIS is a sentiment, it's a symbol. It's something where people don't necessarily have to have the logistical connection to Raqqa or Mosul to be able to act.
So, for instance, not having Raqqa is maybe a hindrance, but nonetheless, it's no prohibition on the terrorists spreading their ideology.
No, because and I agree with what Raheem was saying. You know, the migration historically through pretty much every major world event through the last 100 years, when there's refugee programs, there's rat lines. Rat lines lead to the exportation of clandestine networks. These are what the Nazis used. These are what the Arab nationalists use. These are what the Islamic terrorists are using. That's not a new phenomenon. Anyone that's worked in the intelligence community knows that. But faster than people, what travels is ideas. Ideas travel much faster. And the ideas that ISIS, the Sharia law, the Islamic fundamentalist ideas that are primarily promoted out of two countries, really. They're promoted out of Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, and they're promoted out of Tehran in Iran. So you have a Sunni Salafist version of extreme radical Islam, and then you have a Shia version. And the two, you have competition all over the world in many markets. Where you don't want to have competition is in who's more radical in Islam, and you're seeing that, and that's what's making the world a much more dangerous place.
So we have those networks already in our hemisphere.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do a lot of work with the Department of Defense, and I do a little work down south in Latin America. And what you see in Latin America is you see that some of the same things you saw in Europe, perhaps maybe 15 years ago. And you see some of the same conversations. Let me give one little anecdote just to kind of illuminate this a little bit for you. About in 2014, so about 3 years ago, a gentleman from Hezbollah, a Lebanese national from Hezbollah, appeared in a country, Peru, in South America. Nobody knew who this individual was. The Israelis had tipped off the Peruvian authorities and said, "We know he's from Hezbollah. He's up to no good. You might want to watch him." They surveyed him for a year, and then arrested him in 2014 with nitroglycerin on his left hand all over his apartment and over 1,000 pictures of critical infrastructure, with the thinking that he was going to carry out a terrorist attack on the UN Climate Change Conference in Lima that year. 2 years later, they stood him up for trial, and they prosecuted him for conspiracy of committing acts of terrorism, and they found him not guilty. Now, I served as an expert witness to the trial, so I'm not very proud to say that I actually went down there and tried to convince the judge, but it was interesting, the conversation that I had with the judge when I testified before that trial. And the question I got was, what is Hezbollah? Like who is Hezbollah? And these are questions that Europe had maybe about 15 years ago, where they couldn't figure out, I thought Hezbollah was a political social organization in Lebanon. I thought they built schools and bridges, for the kids in Lebanon. And I said, well, your magistrate, if you look at Hezbollah's flag, it's not a flag of Lebanon. It's a flag of the world with the AK-47. Because Hezbollah always considered itself a global revolution and a representation of Shia communities worldwide. Thankfully, just on a little more positive note on this specific case, the Supreme Court of Peru just recently, and I say last week, decided they're going to annul the decision of the federal court in Peru. And so they're going to reopen that case, and I probably have to go back to Peru and testify once again. This is with a lot of pressure, by the way, of the United States, who knew that this individual is part of a much larger network that carried out bombings in Bulgaria and Cyprus and other parts of the world.
So, Raheem, the networks that Joseph talks about must be replicated through Europe, but they probably are, I would suspect, and I don't know very much about terrorism, but I suspect that they are even more advanced because they've had more time to develop.
Government funded in some cases. I mean, I'm not even kidding. The British government works hand in hand with a number of these groups. Some of them, not active terrorist networks, but they are what I call Sharia supremacists. These are people who want to bring Sharia and what Sharia dictates for, not just for Muslims, but for infidels like all of us as well, to those nations. The British government actually funds them, helps them. The British police stand side by side with these guys and say, if you criticize, question Islam, you're an Islamophobe. And you can now be locked up, by the way, in my country for that. So, think about that next time you're planning a trip. Here's the thing. you know, you've got now a president in this country, and I hope you all celebrated like I did last night, the 1-year anniversary of that election. You have a president who is willing not just to identify the enemy, but also to take the fight to it. Joseph will attest to this. You know, the dismantling of ISIS in the Middle East since January this year, it's not a coincidence. It's not Obama policies that are now coming into effect. It was a sea change in the way that this president started to do things. Like that, it changed. But this president has a lot to do to tackle radical Islam here in the United States as well. And one of the things they talked about in the campaign was prescribing the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the greatest networked Muslim organization, Islamic Sharia supremacist organization in the United States. They promised to prescribe that group as a terrorist organization. And I don't understand why it's still not been done.
Just want to make one quick comment to what Raheem said. It's a very important point, particularly when he mentions the Muslim Brotherhood. If you work in the counterterrorism community, I'm sure some of you in the audience have probably worked in law enforcement or intelligence, military capacity. When you work in counterterrorism, the conversation really isn't just about the jihadists. It's not. The conversation is much more about what they call the fixers, facilitators, and the financiers, the 3 Fs of counterterrorism. Because these are the individuals that set the conditions so that jihadists can come in and take their actions. And so when you look into the structure or essentially the networks of what permeates between Islamic terrorism, is there's a bunch of individuals that, you know, they probably won't strap out a bomb and run into a building and blow themselves up, but they have the banks, they have the political networks, they have the human capital networks, and in order to shut down the network, those are the folks you have to target. And when you look into some of the stuff that they did in New York and increasingly are doing in Texas, it's really basically going after these folks.
Joseph, you know, of course, before terrorism became such an issue for the United States, September 11th, you know, there have been these transnational criminal gangs, you know, human trafficking, drugs, you name it. Has there been any mixture of them? Have they taken advantage of these organizations that have terrorists taken advantage of these organizations that have existed? Because there is a network there, and indeed you would think that there was an artery that they could exploit.
Yeah, there's a concept that's becoming increasingly accepted within the Department of Defense. It's called convergence. And it's the convergence of networks, it's the convergence of ideologies, and it's also the convergence of 2 different problem sets, right? Historically, people thought that drug cartels were fundamentally different than terrorists, right? In the words of Moise Naim, one is motivated by greed, the other is motivated by God, so they don't work together. Well, that turned out to be false, completely false. Actually, if you look at the State Department's foreign terrorist organization list, 97% of the groups on that list are also on the drug kingpin list of the Department of Treasury. They're all involved in some level of illicit trafficking. So yeah, the convergence is 100% there. But I think one of the things that, you know, if we look at, you know, where a lot of the drug trafficking takes place wholesale, which is the area of the world that I look at, which is Latin America, you know, and I think this is where Ronald Reagan really had it right. We haven't had a coherent policy for our southern flank in 30 years. And it's about time we do that. We'll touch probably on Venezuela a little bit later, but that's something that really everyone needs to pay attention to. But when you have this convergence of terrorism, criminality, in Latin America at least, fundamentally what you're talking about is you're talking about institutions and conditions in countries that lead people to move into this direction. The way I like to describe it just very simply is in any society you'll have 2 enterprises. You'll have a free enterprise, which is what we all want to live in, and then you'll have a criminal enterprise, which is where we don't want to live in. Well, the problem is in Latin America, criminal enterprise outperforms free enterprise, so the incentives change from production to predation, and people naturally move to these activities. It's not that they wake up and they say, I want to be a trafficker or a terrorist. They wake up and they actually move to this because maybe they don't even know exactly where they're going, but it's rentable activity. And so in that sense, I think one of the things that I haven't seen really yet in the national security doctrine is to use things like economic freedom as part of national security strategy. And when you say peace through strength, you know, obviously we're talking about national security, military strength, but we're also talking about economic strength. I think fundamentally Reagan understood that, and we kind of lost our way since the 80s.
I'd like to get to questions from the audience really soon, but before that, I'm dying to ask Raheem a question, and that is, in the eyes of terrorists, would they look at someone like you who has changed, you know, they would think that has changed religion or the family has changed their religion and target you more than others?
Put your hand up if you're the most targetable person in this room. I am worse than what they call apes and pigs. They call apes and pigs Christians and Jews, right? I'm worse because I was born into a Muslim family and I chose to leave. That makes me an apostate. That makes me an infidel. That paints a massive target on my head. And you know, I only have 3 words for them in that regard. Just bring it. I love the fact that they freak out about this every day. I was 2013's Islamophobe of the Year, according to this Iranian think tank. But Gordon, I'm cognizant of the fact that we have an Asia expert, the best in the country, sitting up here on this stage, and we have a president in Asia at the moment. And I wanted to get some thoughts from you on that, because it's not just about Islamic terrorism. There are state actors out there at the moment that produce probably a higher likelihood of threat to the existential Western world. At least so they say from all their tub thumping. Tell me, I mean, you know, a lot of people sort of scratch their heads when they hear Little Rocket Man, right? They think well, he's Little Rocket Man. You've got to go on. They think, you know, can this country, can this little nation really mount an attack against the U.S.?
The problem there is that it's not just the North Korea, which has a gross domestic product of $28 billion. To put that in context, the United States last year produced $18.57 trillion. You know, there are buildings in Manhattan that have a bigger gross domestic product than North Korea. But the problem is that it's not just North Korea that we face, because North Korea, as I mentioned, has a big power sponsor, and that one is primarily China. And what we have seen is the Chinese have supported the North Koreans with, for instance, in their nuclear weapons program, the Chinese have been selling components, equipment, materials to the North Koreans, including semi-processed fissile material, the core for a bomb. Also, the Chinese have been supplying crucial equipment to the North Koreans. In July, they launched 2 intercontinental ballistic missiles. Well, those ICBMs rode to their launch sites on Chinese vehicles. China has probably supplied the most advanced technology to the North Koreans for the North's solid fuel missiles. I'm sure the North Koreans, I don't know how they got it, but the least likely explanation is they developed it on their own. They probably got it from Beijing. So we're facing, you know, Raheem, we're facing not just North Korea, this tiny country. We're facing its sponsors as well, because the Chinese, in a very real sense, have weaponized the North Koreans. And that means we don't understand that we're facing a bigger challenge than it looks on the surface.
Gordon, just a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
When these 2 things come together, China and Iran, what's the overlap there?
Well, the overlap is that, for instance, Iran has a nuclear weapons program. Basically it's a uranium bomb program. That came from Pakistan. Pakistan's program came from China. So what China did was it proliferated uranium technology through Pakistan, through the AQCON network. So here you had Pakistan, one of China's closest friends, proliferating China's most sensitive technologies. And Pakistan didn't do this on its own. They knew they knew in Beijing what was going on. And really the proof was that when the United States rolled up the AQCON network, it was Beijing that made sure that Pakistan conducted its investigation quickly and ended it so fast so that the international community could not find out more. So what we have is China proliferating nuclear weapons technology through Pakistan to Iran. Iran and North Korea are partners. Each year it's estimated that the Iranians pay the North Koreans somewhere between $2.5 to $3 billion for various forms of cooperation, which includes missiles and nukes. So here, is there a microphone? I'd like to get people in the audience involved. Questions? Someone must have a question. There's over here.
You can run faster than that.
My first question, we knew that there were Muslims that were inciting activity at Occupy Wall Street. Are they also involved in incitement of Antifa?
Did you, okay, Raheem?
Look, this is what we call the good old red-green alliance, right? This is the green, the color of Islam, and red, the color of communists. I realize red is also the color of the Republican Party. It's the color of the, well, so, you know, there are some of them in there, unfortunately. The Labour Party and traditionally in Europe, red is the color of the Socialist Communist Party. So we call it the Red-Green Alliance. They work together increasingly nowadays. I think what you saw with Occupy, by the way, was the first times they had started to really come together at a grassroots activist level. And it was really to try and see if they could work together. Don't forget, like, how bizarre a situation it is when you have the transgender leftists aligning with the ultra radical orthodox Islamists, right? You would think they would have nothing in common, nothing to get along on. But take Linda Sarsour as an example. This is the CARE, Council on American-Islamic Relations affiliated, who is also, by the way, a co-convener of that great big women's march that we saw after the inauguration last year. By the way, where's the women's march in Los Angeles right now? Where's the women's march in Hollywood right now? Are they cutting me off? See, look, they're trying to censor me. So you have Linda Sarsour, and she is the perfect embodiment of the answer to your question, which is, what do these two groups have in common? The destruction of Western civilization.
Yeah, Joseph, I was going to ask you, do you see this in Latin America, the same connection?
Yeah, I know, absolutely. What Raheem's describing, this Red-Green Alliance, the common denominator is what they call anti-imperialism. They look at the West as imperialist, so they create a rhetoric that transcends through communists, socialists, Islamists, and everybody kind of gets a different flavor, but essentially pushes towards the same direction. In Latin America, you had a tremendous wave over the last decade. It's ebbed a little bit since the death of Hugo Chavez, but it was called the Bolivarian Alliance. Now, that alliance was about a collection of about 9 countries, not really big countries like Bolivia, Ecuador, Venezuela, Cuba, but fundamentally anti-American countries. And the problem is that the United States never took it seriously. They thought, well, we have, you know, as my colleagues in the Defense Department often tell me, Joseph, we understand we have some headaches in Latin America, but we have migraines in the Middle East. And what I constantly remind them is a headache turns into a migraine if you don't deal with it. And that's really Venezuela. And I want to just make a point about Venezuela, because I think everybody needs to pay attention to what's going on in Venezuela. I participate, I run a think tank, so I participate in a lot of meetings with the National Security Council, Department of Defense, and others, and I've never seen this level of attention being paid by the U.S. government on Latin America in general, but on one specific country, on Venezuela. And you know, since this is, I think, is being recorded, you know, off the record, there is one comment that was made by an official at one meeting that said, if President Trump does not pay attention to Venezuela, it will become his Iraq. Because the conditions that are happening in Venezuela, everything we've talked about in the last 40 minutes, Iran, Russia, North Korea, China, Hezbollah, it's all in Venezuela. And what Venezuela has become is not so much a criminal state. Some people have called it a narco state. That's giving it too much credit. It's become an insurgent state. It's a proxy state for a bigger conflict. If you look at Syria, if you look at North Korea, and you look at Venezuela, it's no coincidence those are happening at the same time. Because the old adage of another famous leftist Latin American revolutionary, Che Guevara, we need to have many Vietnams. So 1, 2, 3 Vietnam. So what they're trying to do is they're creating an international connection. And this actually, I'd like to get Gordon's thoughts on a little bit. An international connection, very similar to what we have in the U.S. is known as the Five Eyes, right? With the UK, with New Zealand, Australia, Canada. We have intelligence cooperation, military cooperation. And so these actors, anti-American actors, have created that alliance. And actually what I'd like to maybe ask you, Gordon, a little bit is, you know, one of the ways to look at this alliance is fundamentally through this red-green prism. But another way is kind of to look at through economics. And when you get to the highest order, you have basically 2 fundamental different systems. You have the system, the international monetary system that's been purveyed since Bretton Woods, which is what most of the West is adhered to, and then you have China trying to change that system. How successful can they be? Is that a pipe dream? Because I think if they were able to accomplish that, that's somewhat of a game changer, is it not?
Yeah, Raheem was talking about connectivity as well as you are. And that sort of puts all this together, because you have the Chinese with very strong ties with Venezuela going back to Hugo Chavez. The Chinese have supported the Venezuelan economy. Right now, Venezuela owes China somewhere between 40 and maybe $40 billion. Some other people say that it's been paid down to $15 billion. We don't really know because the relations between these two countries is opaque. But nonetheless, we have Beijing supporting Venezuela economically so they can continue to harass the United States in our own region. And of course, you have the Russians who are always troublemakers as well in this equation. You have another country called Cuba, also with good ties with Venezuela, also ties with China and Russia. It makes a very toxic brew. There was a question back here.
Yes, I'd like to know what your view is on the role that India is going to play as maybe kind of a wedge to the Russians and the Chinese in the future.
Yeah, India is a very important. The question is, what's the role of India in all of this? And this is one of the bright spots for the world because you have India really emerging from a sort of a pro-socialist view of the world, very much connected to the Russians during the Soviet Union period. But now under Prime Minister Modi, who took office in spring of 2014, he's reoriented Indian policy so that it's much more friendly with the United States. We saw this beginning in the administration of George W. Bush. President Obama continued this to his credit, and we're seeing President Trump establish very warm relations with Modi, who was in Washington at the end of June. Then there were those famous three bear hugs. But Modi is important because we were talking about connectivity. Well, Modi connects the United States with other countries in the region because Modi, in his view, in terms of defending India, believes that he has to establish not alliances, but close working partnerships. And so you see India working with Japan, India working with Singapore, India working with Vietnam. All of these countries are concerned about China's expansionism. And so what Modi does is he gives a sort of a network for the United States to come in and play a larger role and leadership role. So you have Prime Minister Modi, Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan, our Donald Trump, all of them working closely together. This is a very good story, and it's the makings of an alliance for the future. Got to remember that India becomes the world's most populous nation in 2022, according to the UN's most recent statistics, and probably sooner than that. If we talk about who's going to dominate the 21st century, I believe it's going to be the United States. But if it isn't, it's not going to be China. It will be India, which by the middle of this century will have 541 million people more than China. Question down here.
I'd like to know about Libya and what's happening there.
The question about Libya, who wants to take this one?
In the term of terrorism, Libya has become increasingly a stronghold for. So, what's important to understand is we talk a lot about Syria and Iraq when it comes to ISIS, but there's a concept called the balloon effect. It's when you squeeze a balloon, it pops up somewhere else. So naturally, if you're going to squeeze or take territory away from ISIS in Iraq and Mosul and in Iraq and Syria, then they're going to start appearing in other. You're just going to flow to other places. You know, the famous foreign fighter flows. So Libya has become the next hotspot. Libya, and I say it's actually moved even further west. What we saw recently in Nigeria, you know, Boko Haram has become basically a satellite chapter of ISIS. At least they self-proclaim to be. So in that sense, you know, you're going to start to see ISIS morph itself and move in different places. But nevertheless, even if they do that, fundamentally, that's not their strategy. Their strategy is to inspire through jihadist ideology and to grab the hearts and minds of young folks that don't have identity and to carry the black flag and then to carry it out without any logistical connection to the group.
And one of the interesting things about Libya was how fast Gaddafi fell, which shows that these trends that we're talking about move much quicker than we can react in many cases. Question down here.
Just before, I mean, hold on. We have to address the elephant in the room there, which was that the French, the British, and the United States hastened the fall of Gaddafi. Even though Gaddafi said himself, you know, I am holding back a tide of radical Islamic fighters who want to come into Europe. I'm the only thing holding them back. Now, however much you want to take it on faith that he was actually doing that, or this is just all one big coincidence, that was the moment, by the way. I used to work for an organization called the Henry Jackson Society, named after Senator Scoop Jackson. out of London, foreign policy think tank, right? It was a neoconservative foreign policy think tank. That was the moment for me where I said, you know what, no more of this nonsense, drop of the hat, foreign wars, deposing people around the world, you know, on a dime. And then look what happened. Look what is happening in Libya right now. And by the way, you want to really drill back down into this? It comes down to those three words that I'm so glad that we don't have to hear every single day. Hillary Rodham Clinton.
I was born in Cuba. I came here as a child by myself. And as I grew up in Cuba, I saw the Communist International. As a matter of fact, in Cuba, they didn't play the national anthem as in the mornings when the stations open up. It was the international hymn that was played. It seems like the Communist International, which by the way Che Guevara was part of, has morphed, is still very active, and there were different movements of the Communist International all throughout the world, and they still seem to be very active, and they have morphed into many different organizations, but we still see the same goals. The goals haven't changed. They seem to be the same. So it seems like we should be concentrating on the big picture, and it seems like the Communist International is still part of it.
Joseph, yeah, if you can handle that, and I've got a follow-up question for you on this.
Sure. Well, yeah, the 1953 Cuban Revolution sparked a wave of communism, socialism in Latin America. They call it 21st century socialism now just because it's the same thing with a different flavor. But I think when you look at some of the disciples of Fidel Castro and Raul Castro, Evo Morales in Bolivia, Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, obviously the late Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. But there's other networks that also were influential. In the case of Venezuela and Chavez, let me just talk. I want to reiterate Venezuela a little bit. Obviously, Castro was a tremendous influence on Venezuela. They had their own version of a revolution. They called it the Bolivarian Revolution, named after one of the Venezuelan founders, Simón Bolívar. But if you look at how Chavez actually carried out his revolution, it's much different than the way the Cubans did. The Cubans was guerrilla warfare. Literally went to the jungles, hid in the jungles, came out, took the cities, and then toppled the government and took control, and then lasted for 60 years. Chavez didn't do that. Chavez infiltrated the country through the armed forces. It was much more similar to a militant insurgency. And Chavez's influences, this may surprise some people, his influences came from the Middle East. It came from Nasser. It came from pan-Arab nationalism. That's where his influences came. And if you look at what happened in the Middle East, Arab nationalism was a flawed movement. It dominated much of the 20th century conflicts in the Middle East, but then it crumbled in the 80s, and what surfaced? The Iranian Revolution. And what you're seeing in Latin America is very much the same thing, and it's no coincidence that Iran has its footprint behind a lot of what's going on. A lot of what we talk about today, whether it's the ISIS or China, I spent a lot of time looking at Iran, and Iran is a linchpin to a lot of these networks, just because of their mastery of asymmetric warfare, their mastery of clandestine networks, and their ability to push and pull refugees in and out of pretty much throughout the world. There's 65 million refugees in the world right now. That's more than there was after World War II. But where's the World War? What's going on? And so this is the fundamental constant. I think what you're talking at, with the Cubans, they're part of these networks, and understanding those networks is key to figuring out this problem.
Just a quick question. With Cuba so much part of that network, what chance does the United States have of engaging the Castro regime?
Look, there's a myth in Washington, and it happens not just in Cuba, it happens every time. I call it wishful thinking. Just the fact that we think that Washington's policy can really make that much of a difference in another country. So we say we want to open up trade with Cuba. That was the Obama policy, the pivot there, the reversal of diplomatic relations with Cuba to reopen relations. Never mind that Cuba was only sanctioned by the United States. They could have traded with anybody in the world, and they did. But the fundamental problem is that nobody wants to trade with Cuba. Why does nobody want to trade with Cuba? Because the country has no infrastructure, has no institutions, has no property rights. I mean, they don't have any conditions that any real investor would actually want to go in and say, I want to look at you like a trade partner. So there's a myth to say that, if we open up trade with Cuba, all of a sudden it's just going to flourish with capitalism, and then the Castro regime is going to morph or change or topple. It's not the case. A matter of fact, a lot of the arguments used to be about tourism. If we just had more American tourists, just like the Canadians, then they would see us and they would like us and then we would be friends. Well, ironically, the tourism industry in Cuba is owned by it's a family-owned business. It's owned by a company called Cadiva, that's owned by the Raul Castro's, I believe, is his son-in-law. So they keep it in the family, and you're not going to get very far in Cuba without knowing who to talk to.
Questions? If you could bring the microphone down. Oh, sorry there. Just one thing about this. We talk about engaging China and how it seems to have changed China. That's the myth in Washington. Well, now that the Communist Party has gotten strong through trade, it's moving in all the wrong directions. It's becoming much more belligerent and provocative. It is closing off its markets to foreigners. It is doing exactly the wrong things. This is the whole idea of engagement. It's just not working in Cuba, and it's not working in China either. Yes, sir.
Rahim, earlier you had touched upon the Muslim Brotherhood. And in the past administration, of course, in the Middle East, they were propped up, and also very clearly propped up here in the United States. My question is, what is the influence, or what has been the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood here in the United States within our government?
Quite massive when you think about, how actually in terms of numbers, they're still relatively small. I mean, they don't carry membership cards around with them per se, but it's a small bunch of people who are pushing a narrative. The narrative, by the way, is the following. Islam is different and has to be treated differently. It has to be treated with kid gloves. And if you don't treat it with kid gloves, you should be marched off to jail. That's what they're doing in Europe at the moment. The idea behind that, of course, is that when you elevate something like that, it takes up a special place in society and can't be challenged. This is, by the way, the interesting thing about this for any radical Islamists watching the live stream at the moment. What I would say to you is this: if your belief system, your ideology is so weak that you have to enforce it that way, what does it say about your founding text in the first place? Anyway, look, here's the thing. Muslim Brotherhood is fairly adept at working its way into institutions, playing the victim card in a lot of senses, but also the funding streams, as Joseph knows. I mean, almost limitless for blank checks coming from abroad for some of them. One of the things I say in my book is that, a lot of these issues, by the way, there's a big Islamic community center down here now, right, by the way? And I hear it's starting to become more of a thing. You're starting to see the niqabs. That's how these things start. There are some relatively simple things that the U.S. government can do, and then I allude to in the book. I say, look, you want to build an Islamic community center. America's freedom of religion clause is very clear that that's fine, private property, whatever, but where's money coming from, right? And if your money is coming in the form of a wire transfer from a state sponsor of terrorism, or from a country that we know, like Saudi Arabia, has funded so many hundreds of Salafist mosques around the world, sorry, you can't have it. You can't do that. And that doesn't infringe on any of on any of the rights that are in your constitution. And I don't understand why, look, you have a choice in these next 3 years, ladies and gentlemen. You can be Germany, or you can remain the United States. But you have to get these things done. And that means picking up a phone, by the way, to the White House. Sorry, Mercy, your phone's going to be lighting up. It means picking up a phone to the White House. It means picking up a phone to your senator, to your congressman, to your state senators. It means actually doing something about these things. Maybe send them my book. I don't know.
Another question.
Gordon, just one comment on the
with your knowledge of China, is there any way that they'll ever help us over here? Anyway, I'm sorry I didn't stand up, but anyway, I'm old, so I can get away with that. Is there any way that they will ever help us with Korea, North Korea?
Is there any way that
China will help us with North Korea?
The issue is the Chinese will always support the North Koreans because they've done that for decades. But it's the Chinese are villains. But the issue is, and you hear a lot of people say, oh, the Chinese will never drop their support for North Korea. Well, the issue is whether the United States is going to force China to do so, because we have overwhelming leverage over China. Right now, Chinese depend on the U.S. market. Last year we ran a $309.3 billion deficit in goods and services with China. So China is critically reliant on us. President Trump can, for instance, sanction Chinese banks because they have been money laundering for the North Koreans. That's a violation of U.S. law. We can put the Chinese banking system under by designating them under the Patriot Act as primary money laundering concerns. And President Trump has signaled that he's willing to do that by actually moving against a small Chinese institution, the Bank of Dandong. But we should be going after the bigger Chinese banks because they've also been money laundering, like Bank of China. There's so many things that the Chinese rely on us for. But we've not had a president who is willing to use all the elements of political power to move the Chinese in the right direction. We started with that clip of Ronald Reagan. Before Reagan became president, the dominant narrative in American policymaking circles was that we were going to have to live with the Soviet Union, that it was a given. Well, Reagan said, no, they're not a given, and he put the Soviet Union under. Well, we can do the same thing with China. We don't want to put China under, but nonetheless, we should be willing to threaten to do that if they do not stop supporting North Korea. We've just got a few minutes left. I want to ask both Joseph and both of you a question, a simple one. If we look a year from now, is the United States going to be safer or less safe? And Raheem, I'll start with you.
Safer. I believe in this president. I believe that he knows what's going on out there. His heart is in the right place. There are people around him, look, that I wouldn't agree with on everything, but I think his instincts, actually time and time again, get proved correct. It might take a week, it might take 2 weeks, it might take 3 months, right? Take Sweden as an example. Do you remember that time where he talked about Sweden? He talked about what's going on in these Swedish suburbs, these no-go zones, with the riots taking place, and the whole lying media started to mock him, deride him. They were doing this for 24 hours from his statement. Then what happened? There was a riot in one of these Swedish suburbs. We put it up on the homepage of Breitbart.com, footage from there. Left-wing journalists in Sweden saying, yes, this has happened. What did CNN do? Did they say, oh, sorry, we got that wrong, and we should run the story about Sweden? No, they went back to their favorite canard, Russia, right? But I think this president has his finger on the pulse of the security of this nation. I think he really, truly believes in it. So safer.
To summarize that, let Trump be Trump.
100% all the time, without fail.
Joseph, your answer.
Yeah.
More safe, less safe a year from now?
Well, I agree with Raheem. I do have a lot of faith in the president. I think President Trump is moving in the right direction on many angles, on Iran, on China, on Venezuela. That said, when you say we, I think, will be safer, but that's some of the folks that spend their life. So I was in the Marine Corps for 8 years before I became a think tank scholar. Folks in the military. Oh, thank you. Folks in the military, folks in intelligence, folks in law enforcement are not going to be safer in the next year, because the challenges that we're going to be facing, that we are facing, that President Trump are results of not just 8 years, I'd say almost 30 years of bad policy in many parts of the world. And so it's not an insurmountable challenge, but it's definitely going to take a lot of work. And he's going to have to deploy all elements of national security to do it.
Do you see, Joseph talked about conflict, possible conflict in a year's time frame. Raheem, do you see that as well?
No, I think this president will manage to avoid it, and I think he has to avoid it, quite frankly. You get dragged, by the way, in your first 2 years of the presidency into another foreign war. He knows. By the way, the guy's a populist, right? He knows what's going on out there in the country. He knows that's on a hiding to nothing. So he'll do everything to avoid it. I want to ask you the same question: safer or not safer?
I was afraid that someone was going to do that. I actually agree with both of you. It'll be safer. And the reason is that we do have a president. I think that's an important factor. You know, I agree with you that there are people around him who are pushing him in the wrong directions, but he does have instincts. He's an instinctual president, and he will probably follow those instincts, just like Ronald Reagan did. So there's that. The other thing is that, you know, when we have seen in the past, when there's been a failure of American leadership, there have been problems around the world, and they've cascaded. But when you have a president who, through just sheer willpower, whether it's a Reagan or a Trump, does something, then I think that you have the North Koreans and the Iranians and the Chinese and the Russians and the Venezuelans and the terrorists sit up and take notice. And President Trump had a very good trip to Tokyo. He had a very good trip to Seoul. And I think that the Chinese did take notice of that. I wish President Trump were more forthright when he was in Beijing, but I think that over time he will get there. So the answer to the question really is safer.
Let me just ask you a follow-up to that. The difference between when Obama went to China and the difference between Trump's visit. Do you guys see this? You remember Obama had to exit through the back of Air Force One. They didn't do the big rah-rah bells and whistles and everything. They did it for Trump. They did it for President Trump. Is that just a coincidence, or do they respect the fact that this man knows he doesn't want to take any BS anymore?
Yeah, I think that they are unnerved by Trump. And because you had Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, when he came to Mar-a-Lago early April, at that dinner, which was over the quote-unquote the most beautiful piece of chocolate cake, President Trump got up and announced the missile attack on the Syrian air base. Syria is a close friend of China. Xi Jinping was completely flummoxed, didn't know what to say, in fact, said nothing. And indeed, that was an act of will. And you saw, I think, the Chinese back off from the United States in the months following that. So that's, I think, an important sign. The other thing is that President Obama, in his first trip to Beijing and first trip to China, was November 2009. I remember Obama bowing. He bowed to a mid-level Shanghai official, which was, I thought, disgraceful. And then the Chinese took that and actually started to make moves on the United States after that visit because they did perceive sense of weakness. And so, you know, this is an important symbol. Symbols are important to the Chinese. They're important to Trump. And the United States needs to continue to work to make sure that we have the symbolism and elements of American power working to defend the American people and our allies and friends. We got to go. We're running out of time, but we started out with that clip of Reagan, and that reminded me that, yes, we are in peril as a people because of, as Joseph mentioned, 3 decades of misguided policies, but we are Americans. We have done great things in the past. Ronald Reagan did great things in the past by an act of will. And so now history calls us again. I want everyone to thank themselves for being such an engaged audience. I want you to thank the panelists, and I want to thank the ACU for putting this all together and bringing us here.
Thank you. Great job.
You can't keep up with inflation.
Next panel is going to be on economic security and why it's so important to the United States.
In our progressive tax system, as you increase the number of dollars you earn, you find yourself moved up into higher tax brackets, paying a higher tax rate just for trying to hold your own. The result? Your standard of living is going down. Over the past decades, we've talked of curtailing government spending so that we can then lower the tax burden. Sometimes we've even taken a run at doing that. But there were always those who told us that taxes couldn't be cut until spending was reduced. But you know, we can lecture our children about extravagance until we run out of voice and breath. Or we can cure their extravagance by simply reducing their allowance. It's time to recognize that we've come to a turning point. We're threatened with an economic calamity of tremendous proportions, and the old business-as-usual treatment can't save us. Together, we must chart a different course. We must increase productivity. That means making it possible for industry to modernize and make use of the technology which we ourselves invented. That means putting Americans back to work, and that means, above all, bringing government spending back within government revenues, which is the only way, together with increased productivity, that we can reduce and, yes, eliminate inflation.
So, Gordon, thank you so much. Really appreciated what you had to say. Joseph, Raheem. Weakness is provocation. That was the title of the first panel relating to our national security. Strength in numbers. If weakness is a provocation in our foreign policy and national security sphere, how do we make sure that we're not weak? Well, we have to have a strong economy. Now, as I told you earlier, I'm a Kansas boy, grew up in Manhattan, Kansas. I went to the other school, 60 miles to the east of K-State. But I've spent the last 2.5 decades in Washington, D.C. fighting for the kind of policies that will produce a strong economy. But before I moved to the East Coast, I actually worked with what was then known as the Kansas World Trade Center. And I know it has a new name today, Kansas Global Trade Center. But I lived in China, and I worked to help promote Kansas businesses in China. My last day in China was in 1989, when the tanks were rolling into the Tiananmen Square for the massacre. We know what totalitarian regimes do. We have to have a strong economy so that we have a strong national security to keep us safe, and then the world is safer too. How do we have a strong economy? Well, we have to have a lower regulatory regime than we've seen in years. We have to have a sensible tax system where we're not collecting more taxes than is truly needed to fund government. We have to have an economy where businesses are encouraged to innovate, where they will prosper if they invest. We have to have a strong educational system so that our citizens and our workers are ready to compete in the world. And we have to have a rule of law where when people make commitments, we know that they'll be kept. We have 4 people here today who are experts in these areas. Dr. Greg Dolan, he's a medical physician, but he's a law professor. I think you have a law degree as well as a medical degree. Is that right, Greg? He is a senior fellow with the American Conservative Union Foundation as well. David Williams is with the Taxpayer Protection Alliance. He is a true expert on taxes and protecting all of you from excessive taxation.
Trying to.
Mercy Schlapp, I think some of you might have heard of her. I think I kind of refer to it as a stage name as Mercedes. It's always a little jarring when I hear Mercedes on TV. Mercy Schlapp is a great friend to all of us, and she'll be able to provide some insights because things are developing as we speak when it comes to the tax front. And of course, Wichita's own Dave Trabert, the president of the Kansas Policy Institute. We work very closely with the various think tanks around the country in all the states. It is a real pleasure to have him here. Of course, he is an expert on both taxes and education. So he checks 2 of the boxes off that I discussed and more. So I want to kick this off with David Williams. Great. Because the House Ways and Means Committee just today voted out a manager's amendment, whatever that means, on taxes, and the Senate is doing work on taxes. What's going on? What's the status?
Wow, there's a lot of moving parts going on in Washington, D.C. Some are good, some are bad. The House Ways and Means Committee has been putting together their draft of a bill, and they released it today, as you said, their manager's amendment. And what this does is sets the table for the House to vote on tax reform probably next week. I mean, this is moving fast. This is happening very quickly. And there's a lot of good things in here, some things we're concerned about, but this fundamentally changes our tax system. It changes the brackets from 7 brackets down to 4. We would have preferred 3 brackets. They added a 4th bracket of 39% for wealthy individuals. I will never understand why we penalize wealth in this country with high taxes. Shouldn't we embrace wealth? Shouldn't we embrace entrepreneurship? But for some reason, the House included this 40% tax bracket for wealthy individuals. So I'm a little bit flummoxed by that development. But it also, you mentioned that you were in China. The corporate tax rate in this country is 40%. Dan, what do you think it is in China?
0.
25%. China has a lower corporate tax rate than what we have in this country. Ireland, 12.5%. Canada, 15%. This has real consequence. Companies are leaving this country to go to other countries to set up shop. Apple, Burger King, they inverted with Tim Hortons just 2 years ago to get a favorable tax rate. Now that's big business, right? That's the 40% for big business. Small businesses also pay 39.6%, so in effect, 40%. The House bill wants to bring this down to 20%. Well, the small businesses to 25% and corporations to 20%. Now, I really want to hone in on the small business aspect of this because this is what, to me, is so important. Because if you are a large corporation, you can leave. What do you do if you're a small business and you can't afford to pay your taxes? You fire people. You go out of business. You can't go to Ireland. And that's why the House needs to get this right. The Senate needs to get this right, is for small business. Yeah. You know, the big businesses, they will find a way to pay lower taxes. But small business won't. And I think we really need to, when the votes start happening, when the Senate comes out with their plan, is to emphasize what this means for small business. It is the lifeblood of this country. We're talking about millions upon millions of small businesses in this country.
So, David, look, I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to turn to the other Dave on the stage. I'm going to ask a question. I'm not as ignorant as this question might make me sound. But the other Dave on the stage is talking about businesses paying taxes. Now, you're a policy expert here in Kansas. I'm going to scratch my head and say, I don't quite get it. Businesses, what is a business? Who's paying that tax?
Well, it depends on what kind of a business you have. If you're a C corporation, then you're writing the check, but the business doesn't pay the tax. They're passing it on to the consumer, either in forms of higher prices or passing it on to their employees in the form of lower wages. The small business, the so-called pass-through businesses, they don't write the check. That money, they're called pass-through because the money flows through to the individual owners and they pay individual tax, but still, it's a cost. It's no different, a tax is no different than electricity or the cost of goods. It's a cost that gets baked into the pricing and passed on. So we as consumers always end up, the citizens always end up paying the price.
Yeah. A corporation is nothing but a pile of paper, right? It's just, it's what you file with the Secretary of State. It's paper.
Right.
I don't get, I hear George Soros and those crowds talk about how corporations need to pay their fair share. A corporation is a stack of paper. It's the people, it's the employees, it's the owners. Those are the real people. Mercy.
I feel like I'm sitting around like with my father who's an accountant.
Right. By the way, if you don't know this.
So I'll make it a little more entertaining for you all. No.
Mercy's father spent 6 years in prison?
Yep, in Cuba.
In Cuba, because he was part of a team that tried to eradicate Cuba of that terrible, evil Castro. And instead of being...
And Matt always uses this line, and you ask my dad, so would you go back to Cuba? He says, no. And then he says, I'm a proud American, very proud American. Yeah. So he loves this country, and it's, I think, one of the reasons why I decided to follow a path into public service and politics and fight for our freedoms in our nation, and it's why I'm honored to go back and work at the White House a second time for President Trump, and boy, I gotta tell you, it is a riot in there. It is very energetic. The president is incredibly engaged. He asks all the right questions. His gut is right. It's been just such an interesting time to be at the White House. And it's interesting because you see what the media does, the liberal media. It spends a lot of time twisting and turning and trying to destroy the work that we're focused on inside the White House. I got to tell you, that palace intrigue, more so what we do every day is go in there and say, okay, what can we do to move the president's agenda forward? What can we do to help Americans? What can we do to help our country? And it is sitting around the table, and it is figuring very tough policy questions, whether it's on a national or international issues. It's what we do day in, day out. They work countless hours. And I know for the president and for the vice president, you know, he realizes that it's about the heartland of America. It's about those communities and towns who supported him, that he stays very focused on task, which is how are we going to bring American jobs back? How are we going to make sure that families have increases, paychecks increases? How are we going to ensure that companies say, okay, it's now time to invest in America? And what you're seeing is this dynamic of consumer confidence up, optimism among small businesses. They know there's a wave. They know that change is coming because Washington has been so stuck and so swampy. And it's been an interesting dynamic to watch President Trump really make it very clear what he wants to see in the tax plan. And yes, we've worked closely with Congress, both the House and the Senate, and we call it the sausage-making process right now. They're going to duke it out, fight it out, figure out how they're going to get to the end of this. But one thing I think Republicans know is that they have a job to do. They got to pass this tax cut bill. If the president wants to make sure it has 3 parts to this, it's a simplified tax code.
Wait, Mercy, before you do that, I want to ask a question.
You're going to ask me a question. Don't ask me a question.
Then I'm going to get to the 3 parts. Question to all of you. How many of you...
Do you realize it's like my therapy session? I haven't been out of the White House in like 45 days, Dan. Let me speak. Let me be free.
I want you to speak, but I want you to speak with some information from our audience. How many of you have a small business? Would you say that you have a small business? Lots of hands. Okay, so of you who have a small business, are you, I'm going to ask A or B. A, are you concerned more about high taxes, or B, higher regulations? There's not going to be a C of both, okay, because I know the answer is both. How many are more concerned about high taxes? And how about high regulations? About even.
Yeah.
About even. So, I've both. Well, of course, both. Okay, so I read a statistic recently that high corporate taxes, 70% of those taxes are really paid for by the workers, the employees. Right. The business owner, again, a corporation is nothing but a stack of papers filed with the Secretary of State. So that tax on the corporation is shifted mostly to employees. Does the president understand that? And then what are the 3 parts that he said are his priorities?
Well, since you cut me off earlier, no. Actually, it's interesting. You brought up the regulation part and the taxes part. And I work closely with the chairman of the Council on Economic Advisors, and he, I was like, can you just explain the economy, like economy for dummies? Just sit in my office. You're super smart. Let's just walk this through. I'm in the communication shop. So we take very complicated issues and try to simplify it so that everyone can understand. Like my sister, who's from Miami and is not at all engaged in politics. So he explained it. He said, you always have to think about it in 2 terms. To have true economic growth, you have to ensure that you have deregulation and that you have tax cuts and tax reform. It's 2 parts. And President Trump, from the beginning, has understood this. In fact, he has spent, from day 1 of his administration, rolling back regulations that are costing $50 billion. These are the Obama regulations that he has focused on and ensuring that they're rolled back.
Now, Mercy, this was something I was going to ask you specifically to address, and our other panelists too.
Am I just like completely trashing your whole entire panel?
The Congressional Review Act. in Washington, I oftentimes say, people in Topeka, Kansas, and that's just sort of my go-to, because if I say Manhattan, Kansas, my hometown, people out in the East Coast, they just laugh. They think it's hilarious that there's a place called Manhattan, Kansas. But the Congressional Review Act, most people have no idea what it is, but it is probably the most revolutionary thing that's taken place in the last 12 months. For those in the audience who do not know what that is, Greg Dolan, his brain is about 10 times bigger than mine.
So the Congressional Review Act was up until January 2017 was used exactly once to repeal a obscure regulation about ergonomics that was passed in the waning days of Clinton administration. But what a Congressional Review Act says is that once an administration, any agency, FTC, Federal Trade Commission, pick your favorite alphabet soup. Once they pass a regulation, Congress has 60 days to disapprove. But once Congress disapproves, the president has to sign it. And what usually happens, right, so who controls any regulatory agency is the presidential appointee. So Congress can disapprove all at once. Odds are the president will veto any disapproval. But what happens in the waning days of the Obama administration, there were a number of rules passed. Administration switched, Republican majority stayed. Those disapprovals are not subject to filibuster, and so a number of rules went down. The latest one was from the Consumer Financial Protection Board, which is probably the agency that is least controlled by the executive branch. They have no, president in theory can't fire the director. Congress can't control its funding. So it's a very bizarre kind of agency that's currently being challenged in the DC circuit. And so they had a huge rule that was going to change a lot of litigation practices, and that was the last one Congress disapproved, and that was, I think, what, 12th or so? Yeah, but it was like, I think, 12th disapproval. Again, one time since 90, one time for 20 years, and then 14 in the last, not even 12 months, right? 9 months.
So when you see the stock market soaring, when you see the economy growing, when you see consumer confidence increasing, it's because businesses are being unshackled.
Dan, let me just follow up with that comment about the stock market. If you notice, last year before the election, when Donald Trump would talk about tax reform, the market would go up. After he was elected, the market went up. Every time Donald Trump talks about tax reform, the market responds in such a positive way. Today, the Senate comes out with their tax reform plan that is a mess, an absolute mess. The stock market lost 200. I mean, the market adjusts because it's looking for the future. The stock market is not looking to what's happening today. They're hearing what's happening today, but they're hearing what's happening today and how it's going to affect them next year, the next 5 years, the next 10 years. So the connection between what Trump is doing with his tax reform and regulation reform and the stock market cannot be understated.
I also just want to add, when you look at the fact that these in the terms of the deregulation, they're streamlining environmental regulations or reducing them. They're streamlining regulations in terms for infrastructure projects. They're looking at opportunities to basically increase our resources for energy independence, and that includes the Keystone Pipeline, the Dakota Access Pipeline. So there's all these, it's not just in the sense of looking at the businesses itself, but also going further into what they're doing in these agencies to ensure, I mean, the president made this commitment. If you're adding one new regulation, you got to get rid of 2 regulations. And there's going to be a lot more of this happening at the agency level. It's very aggressive. It's something that the president feels very strongly to help ensure that businesses are not feeling shackled, that they feel that they are able to have the freedom to do the work that they need to do, hence also build out their businesses. And at the end of the day, for the president, it is about bringing jobs back to America. It is about winning again, about ensuring that we don't have what is called the offshore model of having businesses in other countries, but actually that they come back. We call it the American model, bringing them back, investing in communities, ensuring that Americans have opportunities for jobs. But there's one issue that we do have to address, which is that of skill gaps, the skill gap. So
I'm going to get to that.
Goodness, I should have written the agenda.
Okay, well, you know, my 5 things about what we need for a strong economy, these people know this and they're trying to jump to it. But we've been talking about 2 brakes on the economy, taxes and regulations. I do now want to turn to the engines of an economy. If the economy is a car and you've got taxes and regulations putting the brakes on it, how do we put fuel in the tank to get that car moving? Well, I think the answer is twofold. It's innovation and it's education. And at the end, we'll also talk about rule of law. But innovation. Now, you heard Dr. Greg Dolan speak. Some of you may have said, well, that's not a Kansas accent. That's something else. But maybe you didn't quite know what it is.
It's Topeka.
It's Topeka. No, see, so Greg, I always used to say that in Kansas there are 104 counties and Johnson County. So maybe it's a Johnson County accent. Okay, so Greg, where do you come from and why is this even relevant to innovation?
So I was born in what used to be the Soviet Union. Now it's independent Ukraine. I used to say that I'm Russian because that's my native language. I now no longer feel comfortable saying that, so for obvious reasons. But Dan is right. Innovation is the engine. Soviet Union was, if you look at basically what's in the ground, right? What's the natural resources? Soviet Union, then Russia today is much, much richer than the United States. They have everything: oil, gold, diamonds, any sort of like these elements that
they had to buy our uranium.
Right? Uranium, polonium, right? But they have any sort of thing you need to build anything, they have it in the ground. And yet, there were no decent shoes to buy. There was not enough food to buy. I mean, it's mind-boggling.
But didn't your father have something to do with doing this?
So my father was an engineer. My mother was a physician back there, and my father worked in a government shop. My father is a smart guy. He invented things, but what did he invent? He invented things, whatever the government sort of in a project the government put him on, not anything to benefit consumers. He made some improvements, and the improvements were fairly minor. He didn't care because the reward for the improvement was the same whether consumers were better off, whether consumers did get better shoes, or whether the government got better rockets, or whether nothing actually happened, as long as you could actually show that you had a better idea. And so here we do it differently, right?
Well, so your father, he gets a patent in Russia.
Gets a patent. He got his reward, which was about 20% of his monthly salary, one-time reward. That was it. And again, it's like 20 rubles. 20 rubles. I think I sent you once a picture of that patent with a notation that 20 rubles paid.
So what's 20 rubles worth?
It was about 20% of the monthly salary. But it's weird to really explain what it is, because on one hand, 20% of the monthly salary, on the other hand, just so you realize how much a car cost in the Soviet Union. So the cheapest car was about 6,000 rubles. Like a pair of decent shoes, about 120 to 150 rubles. So 20 rubles were
$5.
Kind of, right?
You invent a new thing that sends a rocket to the moon, $5.
Kind of.
Yeah, that's what. So in America, we've got the strongest patent system. I'll tell you why. Here's a trick question for you all. We talk about constitutional rights. There's actually only one right in the entire Constitution. Everything that you think of as constitutional rights, well, that's actually the Bill of Rights. Anybody know the one right that's actually in the U.S. Constitution? Any law professors out there? Article 1, Section 8, the right of authors and inventors to the exclusive use of their ideas, the patent system. The patent system in America is the innovation-driving arm of America. And I mentioned that I worked in China. My primary job was to try to get back the innovation of Kansas business owners, where they had provided blueprints or patents, hoping that maybe they could find somebody in China to build these things.
If I could have just one more brief thing. It's not just that innovation for local Americans. I think, going back to the previous panel, I am forever grateful to this country that they took my family, me, my brother. I got a chance to get an education here. My parents got a chance to work here as a physician, and this is a debt that we can never repay. At the same time, I think hopefully we've also contributed some to this country. Again, my parents work here, I work here, my brother works here. But the additional thing, the benefits, whatever benefits we brought to the United States, those are benefits that Russia doesn't have anymore. So if we have patent policy, innovation policy, immigration policy, it takes the best and brightest from there. That means we have them and they don't.
I learned this phrase recently, mansplaining, and I realized that by depriving Mercy of a microphone, yeah. So do you know what? Let me hand the microphone and let all of you just discuss.
No, real quick, just on the immigration piece of this, I think this is why this is something that's very important for President Trump, and it's something that he's spoken several times with Senator Tom Cotton and Senator Perdue about merit-based immigration. I think that's an excellent point that you brought up in terms of so much of our immigration right now is low-skilled, not educated, and so it doesn't match our economic needs. And so part of this with the merit-based immigration system is the opportunity to really know who is coming into our country and ensuring that it's based on almost like a point system, where it would be what's your language skill, what's your education skill, and so that is what is matched with our economy. And I think it's actually the way to go. I think for too long, and for the previous administration, for too long, and even for, I would say, almost 30 years, there has been this sense with our immigration system, not only that it's broken, but that the mere fact that you're not rewarding talent. And so I think that is where one of the areas where the Trump administration is trying to be innovative, is ensuring that we know, number one, who's coming to our country. Secondly, that we're able to match those individuals that have higher skills to come into America if there's a need for it. Because what we first want is we want for the Americans who are here to get jobs first, and then take care of bringing in whatever that gap is and ensuring that those individuals who come in qualify to come in to take those other jobs.
And Mercy, I'd like to touch on that, what you talked about and earlier about entrepreneurship, and really take this message back and thank President Trump for his support of entrepreneurs. For the first time, to hear somebody in Washington talk about the importance of small business. The pass-through is the code, but we're really talking about small business. One of the things we learned in looking at the Kansas tax experiment, it really emphasized the importance of small business and entrepreneurship, the critical role it plays in this country. I mean, we have obviously a lot of small business people in this room, and it's kind of in the Wichita DNA. But one of the things we learned, I mean, the C Corps get all of the attention. They get all the headlines. One of the things we found is that jobs at pass-through companies are almost at parity with C Corps across the country. 45% C Corps, 42% at small businesses. And then the other thing, and this is mind-boggling, if not for the jobs created by new enterprises, this country wouldn't have had a single year of private sector job growth since 1977. Now, not all new enterprises are pass-through companies, small business, but you think about the entrepreneurial spirit and how critical that is, and for this administration to be getting government out of the way, getting more access to capital through lower taxes and through lower regulations, it makes a huge difference to this country.
And to dovetail on that with small businesses is the death tax and getting rid of the death tax. People think, well, the death tax is only for the super wealthy. That is absolutely wrong. I have spoken to small business owners that have a lot of equipment, they have a lot of assets, and that is what they're getting taxed on. So they cannot pass their small business on. They have to sell those assets. So when you hear CNN, I accidentally watched them a few
You must have been at the airport then.
Talk about a giveaway to the wealthy. They are 100% wrong, and it's frustrating. There's so much misinformation, especially about the death tax. Now, what's in the current House plan is to phase it out after 6 years. Just get rid of it now.
We're talking about innovation. I just want to mention one thing. The U.S. is the world's leader when it comes to innovation and patents, creating, inventing things. George Washington issued the very first patent in the United States. Abraham Lincoln actually had a patent. Patents, inventions, creations, that's what really creates growth. And what we see now is that the world is jealous. The world does not like the fact that the U.S. leads in creating ideas, inventing things. So the South Korean, what's called the Fair Trade Commission, the Chinese are doing it, the Taiwanese are looking at doing it, trying to say that a US patent essentially forms a monopoly and then imposing huge fines on American businesses. They're basically just taking billions and billions of dollars from US companies claiming that they're somehow in violation of monopoly laws simply because they have patents. And guess who pays for all of that? Every one of you.
So Dan, real quickly, so Bill Gates a number of years ago said, I have some good news and bad news about China. There are 1 billion people in China using Microsoft Windows. The bad news, I've only sold 1 copy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So innovation is so critical to our economy. The prior administration went out of its way to harm our patent system. The people that President Obama appointed to the Patent and Trademark Office, to the Federal Trade Commission, to the International Trade Commission, to go through all of these places, they attacked the idea that what you create is yours. I see that.
You didn't build it, right?
I'm sorry?
You didn't build it.
You didn't build it. It was consistent with that whole thing. So I will say I'm very pleased that President Trump has shifted the direction, picking people for things like the Patent and Trademark Office and the Federal Trade Commission, picking people who respect the idea that what you invent
And
is
right now,
yours.
the IRS commissioner just resigned,
Oh,
too.
thank God. So innovation is one of those engines of an economy. Education. Dave, what's going on in Kansas? What can the rest of the country learn from Kansas?
Well, first of all, Kansas has to learn something.
Well, that's what the rest of the country can learn.
And that is that we have to, we do have an education crisis in Kansas, but it's not money, it's achievement. And we have, you know, everybody wants their schools to do well, and we want to think that things are going well, but you can't cure a problem until you admit that you have it, first of all. Kansas, honestly, is only about average in a nation that doesn't perform very well. We are not ready in Kansas or any other state producing jobs for today's economy, let alone tomorrow's economy. What we have to do is first stop focusing on money, stop looking at the inputs and looking at the outputs. I mean, we have, and we have a Supreme Court right now that is determined to basically take over this. I mean, they could learn a lot from Chavez. They would like to take over the state. They want to tell the legislature that they need to add upwards of $1 billion more per year in school funding. And even if they did, even if the legislature caved and paid that ransom, it wouldn't help kids at all. Because spending more money never has and never will change outcomes. Money matters, of course, but it's how you spend money that makes a difference, not how much. We've learned that before.
So I've seen the statistics in the past that, you know, as much as we like to make fun of the French and the Germans for theirs, well, when it comes to education, their educational outcomes are much higher.
Right.
And how much do they spend per student compared to the U.S.? Are you familiar with those data points?
No, not what they spend in other countries, but I mean we can look at what they spend in this country.
Yeah.
And you can see, of course, there are some states that spend maybe as much as twice as much as Kansas, and they don't get much better results. But we also see states that spend less than Kansas and get the same or better results. Mm-hmm. And we see that across districts. It really comes down to how much you spend. We waste so much money in education because it's almost as though this is how you prove whether you support something by how much you're willing to spend on it.
Yeah. So Mercy, you have 5 girls. You've got to know something about education.
It's expensive. So if you see Secretary Betsy DeVos, give her a big hug, okay? She is a fighter for education reform.
Secretary of Education, Betsy
Secretary
DeVos.
of Education, Betsy DeVos. She goes to visits where there are protesters waiting outside to not even let her get into a school. Why? Because she wants real change, because she knows that it is not an option to have failing schools. It's important for parents to have accountability. It's important to empower local communities and local school districts, and you don't want the federal government running it all. And it's those teachers' unions that have tried to stop her, and all she's saying is, can't the parent pick where the child should go, my child should go to school? Shouldn't that be the decision of the parent? Why should my child go to a failing school? Let's make it easier for children and their parents to pick the school that they want to go to. And the other thing with Secretary DeVos, where she's been such a champion, is also recognizing that not everyone's going to go to a four-year college. It's not all about the free college and everyone's got to go get an undergraduate degree in pottery. It is about finding your skills and making it so that we have vocational training. One of the things that President Trump focuses a lot on and is working with universities and community colleges to do this are apprenticeships, actually getting real skills that are applicable to a job and actually do quite well financially. And so being able to expand the apprenticeship programs has been another critical component. And again, what we're looking at, closing that skill gap. So you're matching jobs with the skills. Because the biggest problem that we're seeing right now is the fact that you might have all these jobs coming in, but do you have the right skill set? Are you trained to perform that job? And I think that's one of the things that Secretary DeVos and President Trump are focusing on, providing flexibility for our children, for our young adults, and having the opportunity to be able to get the skills you need to then be able to apply for the job.
Can I actually pick up on that since I work in higher education? I think we absolutely must stop lying to our 18-year-olds, saying that everybody needs a college degree. Not everybody needs a college degree. I'll throw it to you. So I work at the University of Baltimore. We are inner city college. Our student population is mostly minority. Take a guess. What is our four-year graduation rate amongst African American population? How many of them, if they start today, what is their chance of graduating in 4 years? How much fantasy do you have?
I've already failed in the multiple choice exam system here, so I will not take a guess.
Under 10%. And they take out loans, right, that they cannot discharge in bankruptcy. They get in 6 years it gets better. At 6 years, about a third of them graduate, okay? That's still nothing to write home about. But if we actually took those money that we give them in loans and sent some of these kids to become mechanics, to become plumbers, to become, electricians. They don't necessarily, not everybody needs, a bachelor's degree in philosophy that they don't know what to do with. And, and I love philosophy.
Yeah, Dave.
Yeah. Mercy touched on one key word here, several, but accountability. We don't have any accountability in education, certainly not in Kansas. Now, if you ask the schools, they'll say, oh, we're loaded with accountability. We file lots of reports, and we might even have some like efficiency audits or something, and we have to tell the feds how we spent money. That's not accountability. Accountability is if you don't perform, if you don't improve outcomes, there is a consequence to the district. And that consequence, we think, is if you're not going to educate these kids, then let them leave with the taxpayer, let them take their taxpayer money and go elsewhere.
So, before we take questions, I want to make a comment and tie things together. My comment is, you've heard us talk about high taxes. How many of you think your taxes are too high? You've talked about match slap my boss, because that's my salary. I want your taxes lower. We've talked about regulations. Those are the brakes. We've talked about the engine, innovation, education. You've probably heard most of these things at different times. Sometimes a liberal or a real left-wing person will say, you're just being selfish. You just want more of your money. Or, if we deregulate, you're going to just have Alar put on apples and then kids will die. Why are we here today? It's to remind you that our national security, our ability to live free lives, is directly related to these issues that we're talking about on this panel. If we do not have a strong economy, we have a weak military. We have a weak posture in the world. And weakness is provocation. It is your duty as good Americans to generate wealth so that we can have a strong nation. That's the most important thing for you to remember in terms of big macro issues. Lots of data points here to keep in mind.
Can I just throw
Yeah.
one quick thing? And it's our duty as parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles to remind our children the value of work, the dignity of work, of hard work ethic. That this whole mentality from the left about free this and free that, and that I'm entitled to have this and I'm entitled, that's not America. America is what we build. America is what we create. It's our innovation. It's the way we can actually be the engine of this nation. And it is so important for us, and I, as a parent, that we remind our children, yes, you know, guess what? Your parents sometimes do have to work 14-hour days, and it's tough, and it's hard, but goodness gracious, thank God I live in America. And that's a critical lesson that I think for our family that we definitely just teach our children and remind them that, you know, nothing that's important, nothing that's that important. It's about being able to be free to make your choices, economic choices, and the choice of who you want to elect as your leader, and have your ability to also have the ability to speak freely. These are the precious values of our country that many countries don't have. And what we've seen in the case of Venezuela, for instance, a free nation in a matter of less than a decade becoming the chaotic mess that it's become. And that is why our democracy is so fragile, and that is why it is important every day to remind our children that we can't take our freedom for granted.
Now, do we have a microphone out here for any questions? Okay, so Sebastian has a microphone. I'm going to say this one thing. I gave you one pop quiz. I'm going to give you another pop quiz before we take the first question, maybe back there. Our national anthem, by the way, every intern, every employee who starts at ACU on their first day, I quiz them on this. Don't feel bad if you don't have the answer, because hardly anybody ever gets this right. What's the punctuation mark at the end of our national anthem? Oh my goodness, they got it right off the bat. It's a question mark. Our national anthem ends in a question. And why is that significant? That question is whether the flag still flies over a free and a brave people. You know, sometimes I get a smarty
And you
comment
don't want
like that.
Dan to sing, that would be disastrous.
It's every time you hear that national anthem sung at a football game, a NASCAR rally, remember, we are asking ourselves if we are still a free and brave people. And I tell you what, that last election, as Raheem pointed out, I think it was Raheem, who said, thank God it's not President Hillary Rodham Clinton. That question was in serious doubt whether we could remain a free and brave people, but we still have to fight for it every day. We have to have a strong economy so we can have a strong national security, so that we can all be free. So, first question. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for all of you coming. This may be an inside baseball question to Mercedes, but a lot of people, we understand that all the government positions maybe don't have to be filled, that we could cut back on some of those positions. But what I'd like to know is, how is President Trump doing getting those positions filled? A lot of people say, well, as conservative or as Republicans, we need to be fighting the Democrats instead of ourselves. But what I understand is that we need to be fighting the establishment and the ingrained swamp before we can ever take the Republicans on. And how is President Trump doing getting those important positions filled with people that have his own agenda?
How does he get his team on the field?
Well, we have a problem right now, which is called the Senate. And right now, so where are we, November? I don't even know the date anymore because all the days just blur together. By this time, during the first term of President Obama, he had over 67% of his political nominees filled, meaning they were confirmed, went through Congress, done, they were working. Today, President Trump only has about 36% of the positions filled in terms of gone through the confirmation process, Senate confirmed. The Senate has obstructed and has not pushed forward and confirmed many of the president's nominees.
And Chuck Schumer is not going to change.
It has been incredibly infuriating because every day that those positions are not filled is a day lost in pushing the legislative agenda for the president. So I think that that's been one of the biggest challenges that we have faced, and it's a political game that they're playing by not allowing the president's nominees to get through the confirmation process and begin working. I mean, even our ambassadors, they just, I think, pushed through 12 ambassadors this past week. We're talking November. This is almost a year out. You've had critical nations without an ambassador that's there to speak on behalf of President Trump. It is incredibly troubling. It has been, I think, a huge frustration that we've had with the Senate.
Where's Sebastian? There he is.
Yes, I have a question here. I'll just stand up. This has to do with taxes, and it's related to where, as a conservative, where are we supposed to land when it comes to taxes? I've been listening in on 3, 4, 5 different conference calls. You know, there's not the carried interest, tax is not in there. The flow-through tax is only going to apply to 30% of the income. We've got the top tax rate wasn't 36, it's 35, and now it's 39.
Yeah. Let's have the two Daves answer this.
Can I just finish?
They're real experts in this space.
I just need to finish the question. There's so many choices, and we've got this $1.5 trillion, I guess that's the bogey that we all have. So not everybody is going to win in this. There's going to be sort of winners and losers. Not everybody's going to be happy. So as a conservative, where are we supposed to land, at the end of the day? Get this thing done, or are we supposed to get it done plus, feel like this thing also was done?
That's a great question, and we tend to have a habit of letting the perfect get in the way of the good. But I think one of the things we need to do is, it's kind of the KISS principle. Keep it simple, Senate. Just, if they had, there's a lot of good policy reasons for changing something or adding something, but at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is reduce taxes. The simplest thing to do would be just cut the rates. Just cut the rates. Don't worry about the policies, the deductions, the credits, the who cares. Knock that stuff off. If nothing else, make the other guys, and some of our own, vote on whether you want to cut the rates.
So real quickly, with tax reform, you're giving people two of the most precious things you can give them: time and money. If done correctly. You're giving them time if you simplify the system. It takes billions of hours to fill out taxes every year, and obviously costs trillions of dollars to fill out taxes. So it needs to be done where everyone gets a tax cut. No shenanigans with a bubble rate of 46%, no fourth bracket of people making $500,000. There has to be a tax cut for everybody, and you have to simplify the system. It's pretty simple, Senate.
Yeah, the American Conservative Union for over 5 decades has always stood for, when we do tax reform, everybody gets lower rates, and that's not what we see right now in this House bill. Many organizations have sort of held their nose and said we support it. ACU has not jumped in to say we support this bill. Next question.
Yes, our country is $20 trillion in debt. 2 questions related to that. Is that an insignificant figure? And if not, at what point would $100 trillion destroy our economy? And then the follow-up question is, for the life of me, I cannot understand how these congressmen and senators, they go to Washington, and what happens to them? They lose their spines. There's very few Rand Pauls or Ted Cruzes around. Just for the life of me, this debt just keeps exploding. So is our technology and innovation going to be enough to overcome that?
So we have a total of about a $20 trillion debt, which is close to the entire gross domestic product of the United States in a year. But our unfunded liabilities, the entitlement, is far, far worse. So our debt situation is worse than even you projected. Panel.
Well, I don't think there's enough innovation in the world to change the human nature. And the human nature is very easy to spend somebody else's money. It's not, as long as it's not my money, it's, I'm fine, right? The problem is that that's how a lot of congressmen perceive it. It's not their money. They're spending somebody else's money. And then they go back and say, look, I've created this wonderful new program, more money for education. Doesn't matter whether they've succeeded in anything, but more money, therefore I'm a good guy, right? So ultimately, I think, look, the question is not $20 trillion, $100 trillion is an arbitrary number. The question is it economically sustainable? And if our economy was 5 times larger, for example, $20 trillion wouldn't seem to be that much. The number itself means nothing. But given the fact that this is about equal to our GDP, it weighs down our progress, right? I wanted to my last, remark was that this event is about Ronald Reagan, but I would quote one of my other favorite presidents, Calvin Coolidge, who said, the business of America is business, right? And the only way that business will actually grow and will grow our economy and will make this debt hopefully eventually insignificant is by reducing taxes, by letting people have more time, and by reducing regulation. That's it. It's not rocket science.
Well, let me just, you mentioned Reagan. I'm glad you did. Back in the 80s, Reagan had the Grace Commission, where he appointed Peter Grace, a businessman, to go through every nook and cranny of the federal budget to find wasteful spending. They got rid of $400 billion in wasteful spending. Think about that. In the mid-'80s, $400 billion was a lot of money, and I would recommend to President Trump that he have a new Grace Commission.
Well, we call him Mick Mulvaney, and he is one tough cookie.
The Mulvaney Commission.
He's, and he spends a lot of time. I know that the budget will be coming out February, and they're in that process right now, working through the federal budget, and he's very aware that it is about restraining additional federal spending.
There was someone, I think his name was Reagan, who explained why we have this kind of a situation. He said, government is like a baby. It's an alimentary canal with a giant appetite on one end and no sense of responsibility on the other. And that's what we see play out at state capitals and certainly in Washington. In terms of how critical is the debt, I read something that, and most of you probably know former Congressman Mike Pompeo, CIA director. He was in town recently and spoke to a Rotary Club, and he was asked about what the greatest threat was to the United States. And he said, it's our national debt. It's a serious, not insurmountable. Certainly if we can get the economy growing, it gets easier to manage. But when you throw in the unfunded liabilities, it's a scary number.
Massive. If you have one quick question where one person can answer it quickly, we'll go to it. If it's a complicated question, I think we're running out of time. Yes, sir. I'm sorry?
It's a complicated question.
Okay. We are, do you know what? Go ahead, let's go ahead and ask a complicated question, and then we'll have to wrap up.
All right. So I'm an independent IT professional, and I run my own company, IT services company. I started my company after getting a bachelor's degree in computer information systems and having terrible luck trying to get my foot in the door at a company in an IT department. So what can we do to improve the economy and create more jobs in IT?
That is essential. I think that's been this whole discussion so far.
Well, it really boils down to economic growth again. I mean, look at the last quarter, we had 3% growth. And there were, 3 or 4 hurricanes that hit this country. 3% growth in a time where we had these natural disasters. And, a rising tide lifts all boats. So we need this economic growth. It goes to protecting intellectual property, innovation. It goes to regulation. It goes to tax reform. This is what's going to get the engine going again and help, so many people.
Any last comments? before we go to a schlap video?
Supreme Court has been unfortunately on a tear to try to denigrate and invalidate a bunch of patents specifically dealing with computer technology. Congress should eventually look at it. These are not constitutional matters, these are statutory matters. So Congress should take a look at it. Congress should take a look at what it takes. I mean, it's expensive to hire someone. Congress should find ways to cut taxes, cut regulations to hire someone. Again, it's not just for IT, it's the same across the board.
In other words, government should do what the founders intended.
Go away.
Yeah. Just do what was intended and get out of business way, get out of people's lives. Protect our stuff, you know, stand up an army, but let people innovate.
Yeah. I think that's right, and I just want to stress again, this is not about selfishness. It is about letting people keep their own money, but it's also about our own national security. It all ties together. Now, we were expecting Governor Brownback to be here. I understand that he's had some transportation problems and will not be able to come. I was looking forward to introducing him because when I was a kid in Manhattan, Kansas, the person who sort of brought me into party politics, a woman named Kathy Mowry, introduced me to this university student body president, this guy with the big afro. I'm sure you've all seen the big afro picture. And I thought he looked kind of silly with that big afro, but Kathy Mowry promised me that one day he would either be a U.S. Senator or the governor. And of course, he ended up being both. But he is not going to be able to make it tonight due to some transportation problems. So we're going to go to our next and final part, which is a discussion with our esteemed, my esteemed boss, and his wonderful wife, Matt and Mercy. But
It'll be more of a comedy show, but we'll just, take it from there.
But as we exit the stage, we've got a special video for you to watch.
Another election come and gone, but this time, the mainstream media just got schlapped.
Joining me now is Matt Schlapp, the chairman of the American Conservative Union. Matt Schlapp is here. Matt, good to have you back on the show. Matt Schlapp, they're very loud. Matt Schlapp, thank you very much.
Hillary Clinton is trying to make the case that Donald Trump is a misogynist, and he is pushing back on the fact that she's in no position to make those charges.
No, I'm asking you, not Hillary Clinton.
Okay.
I'm asking you.
This is the very type of elite Washington judgment that the voters in the Republican, that the voters across this country are sick and tired of. When you call them racist or xenophobic, let me finish. They love their country and they simply want to take it back. Republicans don't want terrorists to get guns.
But they're making sure that they can.
No, that's untrue. The fact is they had a vote in the Senate today, and the Democrats didn't support this common sense measure.
Congressman Meeks, he's throwing it on the Democrats.
No, it's a fact. I do think it's absurd for politicians who are protected by arms every day for them to say that it's okay for them to be protected, but that every individual doesn't have the right to do the same thing. When the FBI is finding all types of problems with 2 investigations that are raging into her activities.
NBC News knows of 1 investigation and not a second
That is
investigation.
just not true. I'm sorry. You should read the Wall Street Journal. You should read the New York Times.
I have. I am
There are
only
2
telling
investigations.
you what
It is a fact. There are 2 investigations going on, and you should level with people about that.
It's not that I'm not leveling with people. I am telling you our reporting at NBC
Your reporting
News
is not accurate.
Well, okay,
It's
you
not
can make that
accurate.
judgment.
Which way is the momentum going right now in this campaign?
I think it's Hillary's.
You're
She's
right.
back on the campaign trail.
Grassroots activists that are coming to CPAC, these are not people that feel like Donald Trump is beyond the pale. And Donald Trump happens to be speaking for these people.
Everybody shows up in CPAC all the time.
And why did they come, Joe? Because not everyone's from Iowa and New Hampshire. Some people from states that are never going to see a presidential candidate.
Right.
And if you're a conservative, you ought to be able to have your own version of a conservative primary. This is where you show up.
It's also a lot of fun.
Everyone's got to come to the family reunion. I want to send the ultimate screw you message to Washington. He's the best guy to do that, and I'm sticking with him. I think my party would be foolish to turn them all out because we haven't won a battleground state in 12 years. I think this time we will win.
Wherever Matt is on TV, prepare for an epic slapdown.
She has been in scandal after scandal, which started when she was the first lady and fired the travel office, stole $20,000 worth of furniture. They are a scandal machine, and why aren't we focusing on them?
I don't want to be unfair to you if you don't know. Are there facts that back up the claim?
Did you cover politics in the 1990s? Like Hillary Clinton, who went from dead broke, and in a little over a decade is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. That's the story here, which is what was she selling? Why was she able to make so much money? Where are her transcripts? Why can't we see the transcripts?
When I do this, this means stop talking.
She was fired by CNN, and they said her activities.
You're going to keep saying it 3 times. You can say it 3 times, and I'm going to say it 3 times.
It was the Obama administration and the FBI
has come to the
took
floor of the
that
Senate, and you guys weren't
person,
quite-
that
You don't have to
person
count, it's
off
just
the
TV.
terrorism watch list.
No, actually, he passed the background check and was able to get a gun, and your party
because
says
he
he should
wasn't,
continue
because
to
the
be able to do
FBI
it.
bungled the
And your
investigation.
party says he
Joy,
should be
you
able
don't
to
have to
keep
defend the
doing it.
Obama administration.
There's
That's not your job. It's to let me speak as well.
I don't think I got slapped in the face. I want to make that clear.
Well, that's a lot of my face. That's hard to watch.
The kids are a lot cuter.
Yeah.
Actually, where are the kids?
Who's watching them? It's a really good question.
I know. I have like 10 carpools going at the same time right now, so I don't quite know, and like 3 sleepovers. So I'm sure they're fine.
Mercy, you are a wonderfully accomplished television personality as well, but since you've taken this new opportunity, you haven't been on TV as much. Do you miss being on television?
I don't miss the fake eyelashes or the constant pulling of the hair every day. I'm kind of over that. You know, I miss parts of it but I have to say that I'm so incredibly focused on the policy and working from a communication standpoint with the policy team at the White House, and so I don't even really have time to think about, or I do have the TV on, but I don't have enough time to think about getting back on TV. But what I think is very frustrating is when you see the false reporting time and time again. It really is, when you're inside working for the president, you do see how the stories are being shaped constantly against the president. It's a very clear indication of several of the liberal media that are making a specific narrative because they are still upset about President Trump winning the election last year.
Fake news is real, folks. Yeah. Matt, you spent a good chunk of 2016, as we just saw, going out there. And,
The meat grinder.
Yeah, standing up
CNN, MSNBC, Bloomberg, NPR.
And you and I work closely together on a lot of these
Just so you know, Ian is our communications director, and he's awesome, and he's married to the person who runs our events, Karn.
He's also a jazz singer and plays wonderful
Yes,
piano.
he does.
So if there would be a piano here, we'd have him.
His wife Karn is walking around here with their baby Violet. So just like with Mercy and I,
There
with
she is in the
ACU,
back, father-in-law Jim, sister-in-law Allison.
That's
it's a
right,
family
Jim is here.
affair,
It's an
folks.
all-in-the-family thing at ACU, and we're kind of all raising Violet. So they're all helping raise our kids. We're all helping raise Violet. You got to meet Violet before you leave. But the Ian and I decided as the presidential campaign got weirder and weirder, which was strangely kind of intoxicating because it was like, wow, the people really are going to take over, and they're going to determine who they want to be the nominee. And it really had nothing to do with what people in D.C. thought, had nothing to do with money. This has never happened before where it had nothing to do with money. Even when George Washington ran to be in the House of Commons, he had this whole elaborate plan to pay for everybody's bar bills. I don't know if you know that was like the trick to winning seats in the House of Delegates, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, was to pay everyone's bar bill. It's always been about money, and this really wasn't. So Ian and I, with Mercy's help, we said, well, what do we do? I mean, what's going on the Republican side? Should we be quiet? Should we just go on Fox, which is more friendly and more fair and more accurate? Or should we kind of go everywhere? And we kind of all had the same thought, which is, you couldn't because you were under contract with Fox, but let's go everywhere. And let's let them ask all those outrageous questions, and let's give answers. And I actually think a lot of people who are watching CNN and MSNBC voted for the Republican nominee, ironically enough, because that's how much change, and I think that's how much change is still going on, and you can see the ramifications still.
We've watched it all change drastically, and it's continuing to change, seemingly on a weekly basis. Let me be somewhat self-deprecating toward our operation for a moment. 2016, we were on all of the networks constantly. But in this first year, as we look back on the first year of the Trump presidency, some of the networks don't seem too eager to have you on anymore.
That's right.
Yeah, I'm not seeing you too much on TV. I don't see you at home. I don't see you at TV. I mean, what's going on here? I sometimes see you at my office. That you do show up.
Guys,
I'm running carpool, sweetheart.
What's behind that? They seemed really game in 2016 when the world didn't think that the guy had a shot. And now that he's won, and we're living in this reality.
You know what I would love? I would love the media, to focus on policy. Like, focus on the issues. I think that would be so refreshing. I think that they miss so much of, when you are being able to interact with President Trump and with his cabinet and with his team. I mean, we're spending 99.9% of our time working on policy, literally. Like, we are working on what we can do to improve the lives of Americans. It is what we focus in all the time, and it is for the media. It's a lot of it is just the palace intrigue, who's fighting with who, what's happening. It was for me when I saw General Kelly, who is my boss, who hired me, have to go out in public to the press briefing to talk about his son who died, who was a hero in a war. And we all stood there in the White House, we cried. I mean, we were in tears, because why? He had to go out there and try to defend a story. When you listen to these stories, they call you a racist. It is so painful to watch, and I sit 2 doors away from Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who I just love. And day in and day out, she goes out there, and the insults and the accusations never end. They would never treat another press secretary like that. And the fact is that what's so hard for us is the fact that what we want to talk about is what we think matters in the lives of our families and our communities, and instead of all the personality fighting and palace intrigue that many in the press are just completely obsessed with.
I would say that the main reason, I think, look, each one of these media outlets that you guys, that we all try to figure out, the great thing about what's going on in media, and it's not the media, it really isn't, it's so diverse, is you have so many places to get your news. Online, Raheem's here with Breitbart, Town Hall, Washington Times, there's so many places to go. I didn't say the Wichita Eagle. As Judge Eric Yost said when he ran for Congress, which I thought was a great line, he said he was going door to door, and he ran into an older gentleman when he opened the door, and he said to Eric Yost, as a young candidate, he goes, "Son, every morning when I get up, I read the Bible and I read the Wichita Eagle so I can get both sides of the story." Which I thought was great. I don't read the Eagle that much anymore. Maybe it's gotten better. I don't know. But the point is, there's a lot of places to go to get your information. And I do think that what some of these major television networks have decided to do is it is their job to prosecute the case that Donald Trump is not a legitimately elected president. And if you think about that in terms of their programming, moment by moment, hour by hour, it all becomes much clearer. So, going on some of these shows, they're going to go right to it. You are a racist if you support Donald Trump. You are a hater. They make these charges immediately and frequently. And for me, I have changed my approach to try to shrug it off, laugh it up. Those of you who know me, you shrug it off, you try to smile, you try to turn the other cheek. And I do believe that that's the right theology, but I think there is something important. When someone says something so horrible to you, I can't imagine a worse thing to be called than a racist or a bigot or a homophobe or a Islamophobe, or all these things these words they come up with. The idea that we don't look at people and treat them fairly is the worst charge that can be made. And quite frankly, I'm just not going to take it anymore. And I don't think any of us should. That's not who we are.
Mercy, what is President Trump like in person?
Oh,
And this is on Facebook Live.
He's wonderful. He's so charming. He's incredibly funny. He is incredibly smart. I said this earlier, his instinct is right. He has this incredible amount of energy. I've seen him, especially in the cabinet meetings and his interaction with the cabinet members. You know, he wants results, and he wants results now. This is where, like, Washington clashes with Trumpism, right? Because Washington, everything is slow moving. It's just the Senate's slow moving. They have so many personality issues. President Trump is like, get me a bill, get it now, and I will sign it if it's the right bill. This is pretty basic, people. And so the way he thinks, I think, is such a clash with Washington, and it is incredibly refreshing. The other thing is he's incredibly transparent, and he's incredibly direct. And you know exactly what he thinks and tweets. And it's very clear. Everyone's always like, so are you going to go in there and stop him from tweeting? And then they go and they ask the next person who comes up. And it's like, no, he is who he is. This is how he communicates. This is how he feels he connects with the American people. He wants people to know who he is. He doesn't feel he has anything to hide in that sense. And then, of course, you meet Melania, and you are just frozen because she's just absolutely gorgeous in person and really just a warm and just loving individual. And she cares greatly, greatly. I mean, she loves being around children, and she's just there's something very regal and very special about her. So I feel that being able to even be around the family has been just a wonderful, wonderful part of it as well.
Let me ask you a tough follow-up, since you're used to that type of thing. One of the qualities about candidate Trump that I think made him so attractive to so many people and so different is that he was so clearly enjoying himself on the campaign trail. It was an injection of fun, and that's what the system needed at that moment. Now that he's President Trump, do you think he's still having fun?
Oh, absolutely. I think he loves.
I read all these articles about how you all hate each other, and there's malaise, and the president literally goes running down the hallway screaming at people, and that's what I read about in the Washington Post all the time.
Well, you know, he's going to be frustrated. There's going to be moments where, you know, the demands of a presidency. I mean, we've lived this through President Bush, and now going through with President Trump. You know, it's the toughest job in the world, quite frankly, being the leader of this country. But you know, I think he wants results. It's about making sure that looking at his agenda, that we're able to produce and have real results. I think one of the things that with General Kelly being chief of staff, he's brought such grace and dignity to the White House and such respect. We are all in awe of working with the general as well, because he understands the importance of order and bringing in different opinions, and then finding where we need to be, and then talking to the president about it. But the president, be ready. He will ask you 100 questions, and it's very unexpected. He'll just turn to you and go, "So, what do you think about XYZ?" And then you're like, "Oh my gosh, did I even study that?" And you know, he really expects a lot from his team, and he wants to ensure that we're doing the right thing. So I think to that case, he's been. Where I love to see him is when he's with the people. It's where I think he gets so much energy, and he doesn't forget where he comes. He doesn't forget that he's there to serve, and he doesn't forget that he knows that things have to get done in Washington.
This is not your first stint in the White House for either of you. Do the folks here in Wichita know how you guys met?
I don't know.
Grandma Sue does, obviously, and
she's left the building. Oh no, she's right there.
I'll set it up as.
Where exactly are you going with this, Ian? I'm getting nervous.
As best as I know this story. Well, it's an intimate moment of a couple in love, but it was under stress and duress and it was part of the history that we all shared in it as Americans. It was a tough moment for America, and you guys managed to find love in it.
We met in Richard Nixon's old office. Now that's romantic, isn't it, Richard Nixon?
Are there tapes?
And 18 minutes. It
was a meeting.
We met in Richard Nixon's old office, room 180 of the now called Eisenhower office building. And she was on the communications team, as she is now, and I was on the political team. And just so you know, I guess probably the accountants don't like the marketing team in companies, or the oil and water. In politics, the comms people hate the political people. The political people come up with sneaky ideas to try to push things, and the comms people see us all as just generating tons of bad press.
For the record, this political team when Trump, they're much easier to deal with than you people are.
I bet so. So anyway, we met at one of these staff meetings, and we kind of took a liking to each other immediately.
So wait, my boss was Nicole Wallace, who's on MSNBC, has her own show right now. Just let's put that in perspective.
Yes, you guys know, you guys
very
watch that show.
Be a Republican,
But this
Nicole
crowd
Wallace.
apparently does not watch the show.
Okay.
And my boss was Karl Rove. You know him. So anyway, it was interesting.
So we met. Long story short, we start dating, just, a month into the relationship, and then 9/11 happened. So we're both in the White House. They didn't have like a good emergency system in the building, so you would hear the Secret Service running down the hallway and screaming, "Get out! You've got to get out!" This was after, so the towers, the Twin Towers were hit. The Pentagon was hit, and then we were sitting around in a meeting. I was not with Matt. Matt was in another location. Was in the White House, but in a different location. So I leave the building, go in one place. He goes to the next other place, and he went to the right place, which was where you were supposed to go as a White House employee. Obviously, I didn't get the message until much later.
Comms people get confused. I just want you to know from time to time.
Come on.
We had beepers back then. The young people don't even know what beepers are anymore. So, so what happens? We don't know where everyone's separated.
And
it's
the
chaotic.
phone system stopped working.
To tell you how interesting it was, I ended up in Ed Gillespie, who lost. When was the election? 2 days ago. Went straight to his office, so we were there for a while. And so eventually, I think it was Chrissy, your sister, called. And so, what did she tell you? She said.
So I was in my office, and my mom is a New Yorker. And I saw the one tower had been hit, and then I saw the other tower was hit. And I went back to my office in political affairs, turned on the TV, and saw that the Pentagon was on flames. Now, I'm no brilliant guy, but I thought, wow, if the two towers have been hit and the Pentagon has been hit, we're next. And just as I got up to leave, Ken Melman, my boss, came in, and he said, he always called me Schlapp. He was like, Schlapp, don't you think we're next? I was like, we're definitely next. Let's get everyone. So we literally ran through our suite and got everybody out. But like Mercy said, it wasn't a very good system. And we had two guys who were orphaned on the 4th floor in their own office, and we forgot all about them because you're in a panic. So everyone was kind of, despite what you read, everybody was really just kind of making up what the right protocol was at the moment with watching the television set. So we went running out, and I went out, interestingly enough, with the White House chefs, and a lot of the White House personnel, and a lot of people who had White House on their shirts and stuff. And I said, look, why don't we take all of our White House stuff off and hide our IDs and all that stuff? Because we were scared. We didn't know what was going on. And eventually, somebody in our group got, it was about 20 of us, got a page. Because as Mercy was saying, we had beepers and pagers. And we didn't have all the technology we have today. And the page simply said, White House staff, go to this address. Now, the terrorists have just hit us. We realize it's the terrorists. We're on our own on the street. We can't talk to anyone. And now someone is saying, go to this address. We then had the most unbelievable conversation, like you would have in a movie. Is this real, or is it a trap? And we're having this conversation. And 50% of them said, I'm not going. And then 50% of the rest of us said, we're going.
And the 1% obviously didn't get the message. That would have been me.
Yes, that's right. So I went to I went on the way to this location, and on the way, I know Tommy's here and Gabby and Brina. I did get through to my sister Chrissy, And I was in this very long line for a payphone. Imagine that, a payphone. We don't even think about that anymore.
We're
Long
so
line to a
old now.
payphone. The guy in front of me is in tears. One of the towers has fallen by this point. And I say, what's wrong? And he said, my brother's in one of the towers, and I can't figure out which tower fell, and I'm trying to figure it out. And I said, I have this feeling that everything's fine. I just have this feeling. I was lying. I didn't know. I just was trying to make him feel better. And then as we were waiting in line, that other tower fell. And he put it all together like his brother, unless he had been sick that day or whatever, was dead. And then when I got to the phone, there was a lot of that type of thing in the line. The only person I could get was my sister, Chrissy. And she said to me, have you found Mercy? And I said, I can't find her. She said, you find her and you tell her you love her. And basically it was my younger sister telling me to grow up and get with it. It was really good advice, by the way. Fabulous advice.
You guys have lived through and loved through moments in history together. One of my favorite memories of you two is talking to each other on the phone on election night, 2016. You guys were in New York City.
That's why I was still sober.
You were in the room. Yes. It was 3 or 4
I don't think anybody in America was sober this last election
and
night.
we handed the phone off to
Rachel
you guys
Maddow
hand-
definitely wasn't it.
Tell the story. What happened?
What was it like being in that room?
Oh,
you
and
know?
we went to, Steve Bannon allowed us to go to Trump Tower, which was very nice of him. So we spent the day doing interviews and going to the tower. And it was great because the whole thing was there. Donald Trump was there, his whole family, his kids. The whole RNC operation had been moved there. There was a room dedicated to tracking all the key states. There was a rapid response room. They just had everything right there. And by the way, the president, soon-to-be president-elect, soon-to-be vice president-elect, their wives, everyone's just milling around together. Jeff Sessions was there. It was the strangest thing. And as I woke up that day with a sense of dread. I just thought, I've been feeling so optimistic that we were going to win, and that morning I just had a sense of dread that we were going to get 4 more years of those Clintons. And I just was so depressed about it. And we went over to Fox, and the returns were starting to come in, and we ran into Laura Ingraham and Monica Crowley, Lou Dobbs. I was about ready to go on Lou Dobbs' show. And so at Fox, it was interesting because you had your people that hated Trump and you had your people that loved Trump. And we were in a little bevy of people that all supported Trump. It was the 4 of us, and we were all basically having an emotional meltdown. I was the only dude, but emotional meltdown about was it going to happen, was it not going to happen? And I then did this hit with Lou Dobbs, and the returns were coming in, but I have to tell you, I don't think the news media, probably even a bit at Fox too, nobody was seeing what was happening. Yeah. And they couldn't believe that the polls could have been that wrong. And so during a break, I was explaining to Lou how I saw it and how much more optimistic I saw things, both in Florida and North Carolina. Then at the break, I was excused. Mercy's there. There's some other people in the green room. We get on the Fox computers. We start giving them our version of events, which is much more optimistic. So it was fascinating. It was a really interesting day. And then we went over to we're at Trump Tower. They say, hey, go to the party at the Hilton. So we leave to go to the party. And as we're walking out of Trump Tower, all these, friends of the campaign are streaming out of the building. There's a guy in a hard hat, you just can't make it up, a hard hat and an orange vest, and they're doing, like they do in New York, they're doing the construction at night because you couldn't possibly do it. It's too busy during the day. And this guy, Mom, you could do the accent better in his best New York accent. He was like, God bless Donald Trump. He did it without the party. He did it himself. And then all these other construction guys started chiming in the same thing. And then we passed all these cops. And people were saying, God bless you, thank you to the cops. Because that was a big issue in the campaign, as you all remember, was, the blue lives matter as well as black lives. And the cops, one guy was crying. It was such an amazing moment in the middle of New York City. Couldn't believe it.
You don't have to respond to this, but thank you, Donna Brazil, for proving everything that you said in 2016, ever being right and accurate and fair. It's taken a year, but it's all coming out now, isn't it? I'm willing to open it up to the floor if anybody has any questions for Matt and Mercy. I see a gentleman
Adam.
over there. Is Sebastian around? Karin?
Adam, right here. And Adam, just so you know, on your tax question, we share a lot of your concerns. We're encouraged that they've started the process, because if Republicans don't repeal Obamacare and pass a major tax cut bill, or as the president likes to say, a cut bill, I think there's going to be hell to pay with the voters. So we got to get the bill done, but they got to make it better.
Got to be a good bill.
Can you help us work through, like, in the Republican Party, everybody seems to be like on different sides, and we're all supposed to be on the same team, but like, you know, who are we, and what are we?
It's a great question. I'll jump at it first, Mercy, and then you can go. But what I would tell you is that there's no such thing as like a Democratic Party and a Republican Party, and one wins and the other wins. It's much more coalitional, even though this is America and we're not Europe. It's much more coalitional than we oftentimes remember. And there are a lot of people that vote for Republican candidates who aren't Republicans. Sometimes they call themselves conservatives. Sometimes they call themselves independents. Same thing is true for Democrats. So roughly, I think most conservatives and Republicans kind of come together, and most liberals and Democrats come together. The problem with that is this. So much of what the Republican Party has bought into over the decades, some wonderful things that we talked about here today with the Reagan legacy. So many of the things the Republican Party talked about in the last couple of decades didn't turn out to be quite so to a lot of voters. And I think that's definitely true for the left, and their increased radicalism and progressivism. And so I just would say to you, Adam, I think it's changing. People are shedding titles and picking up new titles, or maybe don't want any title at all. I think Americans don't want to join things like they wanted to, like, you know, all these community groups we used to join. I think people don't join that as much. I think people want to be independent, and they want to be of their own mind. And for a lot of Republicans who are traditionalists by and large, it scares the hell out of them, all this change. And once again, going back to the strategy we pulled together at ACU was to embrace the change, to listen to people, to listen to what they are saying, and then to try to take what's not so good about it and get it on a better path, and really embrace what's good about it, and just understand that the Republican Party is going to change going forward, and the conservative movement is changing going forward, and that the American people are in charge. And the only part of that that would scare me is if we start to shed these conservative values and beliefs. But I don't believe that's what's happening. I think people are very open to hearing this message.
And I do just want to say, I want to say one quick thing is, it's critical that we keep the House. It's critical that we keep the Senate. If the Democrats win control of the House, there will be no movement, it will be very little to no movement in the president's legislative agenda. So it is critical with these midterm elections coming up that these seats are going to be very, very competitive. And I know, and there is this sense within the Republican Party of where it is. And I think being divided is complicated, and it's important to find that united voice and to understand that President Trump is the leader of the party. And one of the things he's done so effectively is connect with the American worker. That's something that the Democrats have always laid claim to, and it's really President Trump who's focused on helping the American worker.
Yeah, I think that's right. And let me just mention one thing else. Let's just put it out there on the table. One of the things we do, all of you in this room, maybe most of you are conservatives, maybe most of you are Republicans, maybe most of you are both. You don't agree on everything. There's disagreement in this room. Guess what? That's what makes the world go round. That's what makes us Americans. We're fiercely independent. We don't want to be homogeneic in all of our views. And so guess what? We're going to have primaries. And that's okay. We should be able to disagree with each other as Republicans and as center-right people. It's okay to disagree. And I think there are just some people who believe that all of that division results in negative things for our movement. And I would say hiding it, pushing it under the rug, not discussing it is actually, I think, more dangerous. So I'm not advocating for primaries in every case, as some do, but I'm also saying it's okay. It's part of this process. I think it'll make our party better. and I think we ought to expand our coalition. And as Mercy says, we ought to be a majority party. We ought to be able to win everywhere. Because if we can win everywhere, we can get these things implemented that we talked about today.
The media, the liberal media's narrative is that the Republican Party is in terrible shape. But I believe that the Democrat Party is actually in worse shape than the Republicans at this point. I cite Donna Brazil's book as Exhibit A. Do you agree or disagree with me?
You're brilliant. I agree with you completely. The Donna Brazil, you know, first of all, I think she deserves a little bit of criticism for the fact that she herself leaked those questions to John Podesta and to Hillary Clinton during the primary process with Bernie Sanders. So she's a little bit trying to have her cake and eat it too. But I also think she's very brave to actually say what the truth is, which is she found the written documentation that, guess what, it was rigged.
Let me push back a little bit on what you're saying. I just saw Tom Perez doing the full Ginsburg on television saying that these recent elections, Gillespie and Northam and the governorship of New Jersey, that this is a big shot in the arm for the Democrat Party, that this foretells the big victories that they're going to get in 2018. What do you say to that?
You know, so I don't know if you've heard this term, the swamp. I don't know where you know where the swamp lives. Northern Virginia. If there was any state in the Union that, even though it is in some ways evenly divided, but it's more of a blue state, where the Trump message was going to encounter turbulence, it was at the state where the swamp lives. Now, the swamp also lives in Maryland and D.C., I get that. But when you're taking on what he likes to call fake news, and they all live in that state, and when you're taking on the bureaucrats, which I view the swamp is this left-leaning bureaucracy in the federal government that thinks it's in charge even when someone like Donald Trump is elected. Most of them are our neighbors, and they live in Virginia. By the way, sometimes they're wonderful, nice people, but their politics we don't share. And so I think that was going to be an awful tough state to try out this new Trump agenda. And I think I used to live in New Jersey. I don't know what we want to say about New Jersey, Mom. The idea that it should be a shock that the Democrats won in New Jersey, I don't think it's very shocking to any of us. Look, I say this. The Democrats had a good day. Congratulations. I think they had the better day. We didn't have the better day. I hope they get cocky about it. I hope Mr. Perez and the rest of them think that this is a harbinger and that this means that people have rejected Trump, because this is the line that's on television, is that the Trump agenda is unpopular and he's illegitimate, and you can see the results in Virginia and New Jersey. I hope they keep doing that. That overconfidence is going to give us a great opportunity to keep the majorities.
Mike, last question.
You know, in Washington, when a guy has a pink shirt on like that, we worry that he's going to be a protester, but you're clearly the opposite.
No.
You're the opposite. This is like this is a good shirt. It's a breast cancer shirt. It's all good. Okay, that's right.
Last month. I think you pretty much answered my question there. I just wanted to see, are we going to see more of this Virginia thing? How much do we need to look into the results of that election 2 days ago? Is this something we're going to have to be worried about in 18?
Well, yeah, you're going to have to be worried about it, because the Washington Post and the New York Times are going to make sure that this is front page news for the next year.
But you're talking, there's about 24 swing districts. So to take control of the House, it's 24 seats. And so many of these swing districts are where Hillary Clinton won. So these seats are going to be incredibly competitive. And and the thing with the Democrats and Republicans are both focused on recruitment. So it's who they're going to put in there. Are they going to put the Bernie Sanders candidate, or are they going to put a more moderate candidate? So that's all going to play in. You know, the competitive. They're going to be competitive seats. I think what we're going to see is when you start seeing an economic growth at over 3% consecutively, when you start people feeling, you know what, America's back again, and it needs to be where we need to be, and the issue of national security is a critical issue, and President Trump is leading on all these fronts. You know, I think it will be competitive, but I think the Republicans could be strong and stay competitive too.
I think that the key element of our politics today is we have to just talk clearly and honestly and call it for what it is. That's what really you want. That's what the voters really ask for. They don't really need all of the ridiculous, I can think of a lot of terms I could use right now, subterfuge for describing the way things are. And I know we need to close out, but I would say what we do at the American Conservative Union is we're going to try to interpret what's happening in the swamp in Washington in a way where it seems clearer to you. And what we want to do is take what's happening and tie it to a value that we share as Americans. And it's important for us to do that. And this is where Republicans sometimes get screwed up. I'll give you an example. There's an issue brewing in Congress where they want to privatize the air traffic controller system. And there's folks that think that's good because they say government's too big and we ought to privatize things and we ought to reduce government spending on them. And so they use a wonderful word like privatization. And Dan Schneider and Michi and Jackie and the rest of our policy team got together and they said, well, wait a minute. If it's privatization, shouldn't privatization mean something? And we came up with a 5 or 6 point test. Dan's giving 7-point test to determine whether something's privatization. On this topic, just so you know, privatization is described, and in this case it's by Republicans who are not being accurate. It's described as creating a pseudo-government entity like Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac that has a board that is determined by the Secretary of Transportation, which is not a private sector person, by the way, that locks in union contracts over decades that will actually mean that the labor spending will be higher instead of lower with no ability to hire and fire and change things. You all know who raised your hands earlier, those of you who run businesses or have businesses, what's your number one cost? It's usually your labor. Sometimes it's energy, sometimes it's other things, but it's usually labor. And if at the federal government level, if it's always going to be federal union contracts locked in that we can't have any impact on, there's no privatization to that. And of course, the other thing is, even as conservatives, there are certain things the government should do really, really well. The military should be well funded. It should know how to kill people, break things, and keep us safe. And I, for one, am okay with an air traffic control system and only having one. And those of you who are pilots in the room, I know there are a lot, probably feel the same way. And it's also about big versus little. So on all these issues, and that's just one that I choose that we haven't talked about today, what we're going to do as an organization is we're going to try to break through this verbiage that people use and explain it to you in very clear terms. And then you get to make up your mind. You get to make up your mind whether or not you think the latest healthcare version makes sense. You get to make up your mind as to whether the latest version on this tax bill makes sense. And that's what's going to make the country better.
Folks, that's the last word.
Can I say one quick thing?
One more for Mercy.
I always have the last
Mercy
word.
works at the White House, so we defer.
No, but I want to say a real cute story. So our oldest, who's 14, and she started 9th grade, and so she was telling me, she's like, Mom, I'll probably live in a big city at some point. She goes, but I really want to see, I would like to find my husband somewhere in the Midwest, the same way you did with Dad.
Oh, I love that.
And so, I'm born and raised in Miami, very traditional Cuban family. I came here to Kansas almost 16 years ago, and I was welcomed with open arms by the Schlapp family and by this community. And so it is my home as well. And so I do, seriously, so many blessings, because the Kansan values are American values. And those are the values that we have to enshrine and ensure that it's passed on from generation to generation. And if there's someone that understands that, that's President Trump and Vice President Mike Pence.
And you guys are doing a great job of doing that with your family.
Mercy's crying.
Folks, that's Matt Schlapp and Mercedes Schlapp.
Thank you all for being here. This
Aspera.
is wonderful. We appreciate it. We're going to hang out, and let's make sure we get to say hi.
Darling, I hope that you'll be here when I need you the most. So